$20,000 for a USB stick that steals everything you type. The NSA built it. Someone stole it. What followed changed cybersecurity forever. This is completely true. April 2017. Jake Williams woke to 99 notifications. Shadow brokers had just exposed his secret. He was a former NSA hacker. His life would never be the same. To understand how, we go back to 2013, when a mysterious document appeared on the internet. The Ant Catalog, a glimpse into the NSA's arsenal. In the quiet corners of the internet in 2013, a document appeared that would forever change how we understood surveillance. They called it the Ant Catalog, and it read like science fiction, except every device in it was real. Someone with access to highly classified National Security Agency documents had taken the ANT catalog and given it to journalists at Der Spiegel. The catalog then made its way into the public eye, spreading across the internet like ripples on a still pond. The answer to who leaked it has never been definitively settled. But the real question that captivated the world was simpler and far more unsettling. What exactly was this ANT catalog? ANT stands for Advanced Network Technology, and within this catalog lay a carefully organized list of hacks, exploits, and cyber surveillance devices that the National Security Agency could deploy for certain missions. If you worked at the NSA and needed an exploit for a particular operation, you would look through this catalog and request one of these devices or pieces of software. It was, in essence, a shopping list for spies. Let me walk you through a few of these devices. The NSA created a device with the codename Cottonmouth. At first glance, it looks like a typical USB plug, but hidden inside is sophisticated technology that captures all the data flowing through it and wirelessly transmits that information to someone nearby. Someone could be listening in the room next door to everything your USB connector is seeing. The NSA developed this in 2008. The ANT catalog listed a price, $20,000 per USB implant. There was Dropout Jeep, software designed for iPhones. If you could get this onto someone's iPhone, it would give you access to everything. All text messages, every contact, all voicemail. It could activate the microphone without the owner knowing. It could open the video camera. And it could retrieve the geolocation of that phone. The catalog also detailed JetPlow, a firmware implant for Cisco firewalls. Once JetPlow was in place, the NSA could slip past that security guard whenever they wanted, and the firewall would never raise an alarm. But one of my favorites is called RageMaster. It is a small piece of hardware that taps into any VGA port, the connector from your computer to your monitor. RageMaster wirelessly transmits everything that VGA connector sees, essentially cloning your monitor. They would see every document you open, every password you type, every website you visit. The NSA might intercept a Cisco firewall being delivered somewhere. They would open the box carefully, install their firmware, and seal it back up. The target receives the firewall, installs it, believing their network is protected. But the NSA has a key that lets them through whenever they choose. 50 items from this catalog were leaked to the public in 2013. Upon closer inspection, researchers noticed these items were intended to be used by an organization called TAO. TAO stands for Tailored Access Operations. It is a specialized unit within the National Security Agency with one primary objective: to gather intelligence on computer systems. The people within TIO have access to the most sophisticated hacking tools ever created. When security companies research hacking campaigns, they give hacking groups unique code names. Fancy Bear is given to Russian hackers, Charming Kitten to Iran. Security companies investigated certain malware that appeared to come from the NSA. They gave this NSA hacking group a code name, the Equation Group. It is believed that whoever is doing the work attributed to the Equation Group is specifically TAO within the NSA. By 2013, the public had glimpsed inside the NSA's toolbox. The technology was breathtaking, the implications were unsettling, and the question that lingered was simple but profound. What would happen if these tools fell into the wrong hands? A message from the shadows. On a warm August morning in 2016, as the sun rose over America, a tweet appeared that would send shockwaves through the cybersecurity world. Someone calling themselves shadow brokers claimed they had stolen the NSA's hacking tools. The date was August 13th, 2016. Security operations centers around the globe run 24 hours a day, monitoring networks and watching for threats. And on this particular Saturday morning, analysts began noticing something unusual spreading across social media. A Twitter account named Shadow Brokers had posted a message in broken, awkward English, but the meaning was crystal clear and deeply troubling. The tweet read, "We follow Equation Group traffic. We find the Equation Group source range. We hack the Equation Group. We find many Equation Group cyber weapons. You see the picture? We give you some Equation Group files for free. You see, this is good proof. We are auctioning the best files." Someone was claiming they had successfully hacked the hackers at the NSA, and to prove it, they were giving away some files for free as a demonstration and auctioning the rest. The message included links to download files from GitHub. Anyone could examine them. And that is exactly what security researchers around the world began doing. Within hours, experts had downloaded the files and started analyzing them. What they found was both fascinating and deeply concerning. The files contained exploits specifically designed to attack Cisco and Fortinet firewalls, devices that protect countless networks around the world. The exploits shadow brokers released were zero-day exploits. Imagine a lock with a hidden flaw. The manufacturer does not know about it. Only the person who discovered it knows, and they are keeping it secret. That is a zero-day exploit, a vulnerability the software maker does not know exists. Security researchers began testing these exploits carefully. The answer came back. Yes, these exploits were genuine. They worked exactly as described. They could compromise fully patched Cisco and Fortinet firewalls. Both companies confirmed these were vulnerabilities they had not known about and immediately began working on patches. But the damage was already done. The exploits were now public. Any hacker in the world could download them and use them. Shadow brokers also announced they were auctioning off their remaining exploits. They wanted payment in Bitcoin, but the auction was not successful. In the first 24 hours, they received only $937. Still, the damage was real. News outlets around the world began picking up the story. The Guardian, Ars Technica, Wired, the New York Times. This was front-page news. The shadow brokers had captured the attention of the world. The question was whether this was just the beginning. Did they really have more exploits? And perhaps most importantly, what did they really want? In a small security firm in Georgia, one man was paying particularly close attention. He had reasons to care about shadow brokers that went far deeper than professional interest. But those reasons were still his secret, at least for now. The security expert. In Augusta, Georgia, a security expert sat at his desk, reading the shadow broker's message with more concern than most. Jake Williams had spent decades in information security, but this threat felt different. This threat felt personal. Jake Williams is the founder of Rendition InfoSec, a security company based in Augusta. If you follow cybersecurity on Twitter, you might know him as Malware Jake. He had built a following of around 50,000 people. These are security professionals, researchers, analysts who take his observations seriously. Rendition InfoSec is like a specialized emergency response team for the digital world. One of their core services is a managed security operations center with analysts working around the clock, monitoring their clients' networks for threats. They also conduct red team operations, where ethical hackers attack a company's own systems to find weaknesses. And they provide incident response when companies discover they have been hacked. Beyond running Rendition, Jake is also an instructor for SANS, one of the most respected names in information security training. He teaches courses on threat intelligence, forensics, penetration testing, and threat detection. On the morning of August 13th, 2016, one of the large screens in Rendition's SOC was displaying a Twitter feed, and on that feed, the shadow broker's message appeared. Jake was not in the office that morning. He was on site with a client, handling a security incident. They had set up a war room in a conference room. But even in the middle of managing a client crisis, the Rendition team knew this shadow broker's situation was important enough that Jake needed to know immediately. Someone from the SOC called. "Have you seen this? Are you seeing what is happening on Twitter?" Jake pulled up Twitter and found the shadow broker's post. Even though he was helping a client, even though he had pressing responsibilities, Jake felt this was important enough to download these files and examine them himself. He downloaded the files. He began looking through the code. And what he found troubled him deeply. The exploits looked legitimate. They had the hallmarks of sophisticated, professional work. This was not something a casual hacker would create. This was the work of experts with time, resources, and advanced capabilities. The client he was helping happened to have significant Cisco equipment in their network. Some of this equipment was vulnerable to exactly the kinds of exploits shadow brokers had just released. Jake began digging into the shadow broker's dump, cross-referencing the exploits with his client's infrastructure. Back at the Rendition SOC, analysts were doing the same assessment for all their clients. This is the reality of cybersecurity work. When a major dump like this happens, security professionals drop everything and assess the impact. All other work gets pushed aside. As Jake continued his analysis, he could not help but think about the larger implications. Who were these shadow brokers? How did they get these tools? What else did they have? Little did the world know, Jake Williams had a connection to this story that went far deeper than being a concerned security professional. He carried a secret about his past, and that secret would not stay hidden forever. The second strike. 2 months after their first appearance, as autumn leaves began to fall, the shadow brokers returned. This time, they brought something different. Not exploits, but evidence. Evidence of where the NSA had already been. By late October 2016, many people were beginning to wonder if shadow brokers had been a one-time event. But the world of cybersecurity in October was anything but quiet. The United States was in the final stretch of a contentious presidential election. Questions about Russian interference were beginning to surface. On October 16th, Vice President Joe Biden appeared on NBC's Meet the Press. The conversation turned to Russia and cyber attacks. Biden said the United States was sending a message to Putin. "He'll know it," Biden said. "I hope the public will not." 2 weeks later, shadow brokers posted their second dump. The post opened with a question. Why is Dirty Grandpa threatening the CIA's cyber war with Russia? They seemed to be referring to Biden. Shadow brokers were watching American political news and responding. This time, shadow brokers did not release exploits. They posted a large list of IP addresses. Every device connected to the internet has an IP address, essentially a unique numerical identifier. The list contained hundreds of these addresses. Shadow brokers claimed this was a list of servers around the world that the NSA had either infected with malware or was using as launching points for hacking operations. For security professionals, this list represented something valuable, something actionable. Finally, here was information they could use to defend their networks. Jake Williams and the team at Rendition saw immediate value. They maintain extensive logs of network traffic. With this list of IP addresses, they could go back through their historical network data and search for matches. Do we see any IP addresses from this shadow brokers list connecting to our clients' networks? If you find that one of these IP addresses is connected to your network, that is an indicator of concern. It suggests you should investigate further. Jake and his team went through this process carefully. For some clients, they found nothing. For others, they found connections that warranted deeper investigation. Jake continued to analyze what shadow brokers had released, writing about his observations, sharing insights with the security community. The second dump had not generated the same level of media attention as the first, but for security professionals, this dump was perhaps more interesting because it gave them tools to investigate their own networks. The question on everyone's mind was whether shadow brokers would return again. They had established a pattern. Would there be a third? The answer was yes. But when shadow brokers returned in the new year, they would bring something far more dangerous. They would bring tools that could fundamentally change how security investigations worked. The Windows Arsenal. In January 2017, as a new president took office, the shadow brokers made an announcement. They were saying goodbye. But their farewell gift would change Windows security forever. Into this already complicated landscape, shadow brokers stepped once again. They explained their reasoning with awkward, broken English. They had not received the Bitcoin they were hoping for, and so they announced they were done. They were saying goodbye. But shadow brokers were not leaving empty-handed. This time, they were releasing tools that worked on Windows, the operating system that powers hundreds of millions of computers. The dump contained 61 files, Windows executables, link libraries, and drivers. Each one shadow brokers claimed, had been developed by the Equation Group. And once again, when security researchers examined them, they found that shadow brokers appeared to be telling the truth. Among these files, one in particular caught the attention of Jake Williams and other incident response professionals. The file name suggested this was a tool for editing Windows event logs, for manipulating them in ways that should not be possible. To understand why this mattered, we need to talk about Windows event logs. Imagine you are a detective investigating a crime. You look for security camera footage because it provides a record of who came and went. In the world of computers, Windows event logs serve a similar purpose. For security professionals, these event logs are sacred. When investigating a potential breach, you rely heavily on these logs. They tell you the story of what happened. Historically, it has been possible for an administrator to clear all event logs or turn logging off completely. But when this happens, Windows creates a new event documenting that action. What administrators could not do was surgically edit individual events. Or so everyone believed. The shadow broker's dump changed that. Suddenly, everyone could see proof that this capability existed. The tool could disable Windows event logging without creating an event that said logging had been disabled, and it could delete individual events from the log. Imagine security camera footage where certain frames have been carefully cut out. This was a game changer for incident response. Jake Williams recognized this immediately. He wrote a blog post explaining to the security community why this tool was so significant. For years, forensics investigators had relied on event logs as a trusted source of truth. Now, they could no longer make that assumption. Investigators would now need to look for different kinds of evidence. They would need to check for gaps. If event logs are numbered sequentially, and you see event 97, 98, then 100, event 99 is missing. Its absence is itself evidence. The release of these Windows tools reinforced something the security community already suspected. The NSA had been developing sophisticated capabilities for compromising Windows systems. And now, thanks to shadow brokers, those tools were public. Shadow brokers had said they were leaving. The security community watched and waited. Would shadow brokers really disappear? Was this actually the end? As January turned to February and then to March, the silence from shadow brokers continued. Perhaps they really were done. But in the world of cybersecurity, silence is not always what it seems. And as spring approached, shadow brokers would prove they had been merely resting. A political message. 3 months of silence. Then, in early April 2017, they were back. But this time, the shadow brokers had a message not just for the cybersecurity community, but for the President of the United States. Shadow brokers had said goodbye in January. For 3 months, they had been quiet. The cybersecurity community had cautiously begun to believe that perhaps the shadow brokers chapter was finally closed. But on April 8th, 2017, they returned. And this time, their post had a distinctly political tone. The message opened with shadow brokers' signature style, that peculiar, broken English. But the meaning was clear enough. Shadow brokers were addressing President Donald Trump directly. They wrote that they had voted for him. They wrote that they supported him. But now, they said, they were losing faith. It appeared, they claimed, that Trump was abandoning his base. This was remarkable. Here was a group releasing stolen NSA hacking tools, a group that many suspected had ties to Russian intelligence, claiming they had voted for the American president. Was this genuine, or was this strategic misdirection? Shadow brokers also released more stolen tools, more exploits. The security community once again found themselves downloading files, analyzing code, and updating their defenses. Jake Williams watched all of this with particular interest. By this point, he had been following shadow brokers for 8 months. He had analyzed their tools, written about their impact, and thought deeply about their motivations. And as he looked at this latest dump and its timing, a pattern began to emerge. Jake began going back through the timeline. When had shadow brokers released their dumps? And what was happening in the news around those times, particularly news about Russian hacking? The first dump came in August, when questions about Russian hacking were beginning to surface. The second came in October, just after Biden threatened cyber retaliation against Russia. The January dump came as the new administration took office, and now this April dump, coming when Russian hacking was again prominent. Each time Russian cyber operations were being discussed publicly, shadow brokers would appear with a dramatic dump of NSA tools, and immediately the conversation would shift. This is what intelligence professionals call an information operation. Russian hacking becomes a major news story, so they dump NSA tools. Suddenly, everyone is focused on what the NSA had lost, and the original conversation about Russian hacking fades into the background. Jake found this pattern compelling. He decided to write about it, to lay out his observations connecting shadow brokers' timing to Russian interests. He wrote the blog post carefully, laying out the timeline, showing how each dump coincided with periods of intense media focus on Russian cyber operations. He made it clear he could not say with absolute certainty the timing was intentional. But he presented the pattern and let readers draw their own conclusions. He published the post and shared it on Twitter. And this time, the response was even stronger than before. The post got retweeted rapidly. Other security professionals saw the same pattern and found his analysis compelling. But the post also caught the attention of journalists. They began writing their own articles, using Jake's analysis as a foundation for broader stories about shadow brokers and Russian information operations. Jake's name appeared in these articles, identified as a security researcher who had analyzed the timing of the dumps and found suspicious patterns. Jake believed the analysis was sound. He believed the cybersecurity community needed to understand that shadow brokers might not just be random hackers motivated by money. They might be part of something larger, something more coordinated. He continued teaching his SANS class. He continued working with clients. Life went on, much as it had before, with the added element of being recognized as someone who had publicly analyzed shadow brokers and suggested Russian involvement. What Jake did not know was that shadow brokers had noticed his analysis too. They had seen his blog post. They had seen the news articles citing his work. They had seen his name spreading across the internet in connection with their operations. And they were about to respond in a way that would transform Jake's life completely. The shadow brokers were watching, and they did not appreciate having their activities connected to Russia quite so publicly. When the shadows strike back, Orlando, Florida, a hotel room. Jake Williams woke to his phone alarm on an ordinary morning, already fighting a fever from being sick. He pulled down his notifications. 99 plus messages. His blood ran cold when he saw why. Jake was in Orlando, teaching one of his SANS courses. These courses typically run from 9 in the morning until 7 at night. But on this particular morning, Jake was not feeling well. He was running an actual fever. But when you are the instructor for an expensive training course, when students have paid significant money and traveled to be there, you push through. He reached for his phone to turn off the alarm, and as he did, he saw the notification bar at the top of his screen. 99 plus. For a moment, Jake's foggy, feverish brain tried to make sense of this. Maybe a blog post has gone viral. Maybe he had tweeted something controversial. But as Jake actually looked at his notifications, neither of those explanations fit. And it was at that moment that Jake's blood ran cold. Shadow brokers had just publicly identified him. Shadow brokers had tweeted directly at him. The tweet was written in their characteristic broken English, but the message was absolutely clear. It read, "At Malware Jake, you have a big mouth for a former Equation Group member. Shadow brokers is not in the habit of outing Equation Group members, but had to make an exception for big mouths. Malware Jake." That was Jake's Twitter handle. An Equation Group member. That was the crucial phrase, the revelation that changed everything. Shadow Brokers was publicly stating that Jake Williams was a former member of the NSA's elite hacking team. The thing is, it was true. Jake had indeed worked for the NSA. He had spent nearly 2 decades working in the information community for the United States government, and about 5 years had been spent in TAO, Tailored Access Operations. But this was information Jake had kept intensely private. His LinkedIn showed he had worked for the Department of Defense, but there is a vast difference between saying you worked for the Department of Defense and being identified as a member of TAO. Jake had kept this specific detail of his background private for good reasons. He was a public figure in the security community. He had 50,000 followers on Twitter. He spoke at conferences. He taught SANS courses. And he had maintained a separation between his current public professional life and his classified past. That separation had just been destroyed. Jake lay in bed, sick, feverish, trying to process what had just happened. This was not just a surprising tweet. This was the public exposure of information he had carefully protected. Because if shadow brokers knew he had worked for TAO, they probably knew more than that. They might know what operations he had worked on. They might know what countries he had targeted. They might know details of classified missions. And Jake had no way of knowing what the consequences would be. Would the United States government be angry with him? Would other countries see this as an opportunity? Would the FBI show up to question him? Jake had thought about operational security over his career. But this situation was unprecedented. A foreign hacking group had just publicly identified a former NSA hacker by name on social media. There was no playbook for this. The uncertainty was perhaps the worst part. Jake did not know who might be interested in him. He did not know if Russian intelligence would view him as an enemy. He did not know if countries whose networks he might have targeted would seek retribution. He had to get up. He had to shower, get dressed, and go teach a SANS class to a room full of students. He was sick. He was in shock. His privacy had just been violated in a very public way. and he had to stand in front of people and teach for 10 hours. Jake would later say that teaching that day was actually one of the best possible things for him. It was a forced distraction. From 9 in the morning until 7 at night, Jake worked. He taught. He answered questions. He functioned as a professional instructor despite everything happening inside his head. The students in his class probably had no idea what their instructor was dealing with. They were learning about threat intelligence and forensics. They did not know that their instructor had just been publicly identified as a former NSA elite hacker. During breaks, Jake's mind returned to the shadow broker's tweet and its implications. He checked his phone, saw the continuing waves of notifications. People discussing this revelation. Security researchers and journalists are all talking about the fact that Malware Jake was apparently a former member of the Equation Group. And through all of this, Jake kept teaching. The routine of teaching, the structure of the class, the need to maintain professionalism, all of it helped him get through that first impossible day. But once the class ended, once he was back in his hotel room, the reality settled over him fully. Shadow brokers knew who he was. They knew about his past. They had decided to expose him publicly, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to take that information back. It was out there now, permanent, public, unchangeable. The question was not whether people knew. The question was what would happen because they knew. And that answer, on that first night after being outed, remained terrifyingly unclear. Inside Tao, the NSA's elite hackers. To understand why being identified as a member of the Equation Group was so significant, we need to understand what Tao really is. Tailored Access Operations, the NSA's most elite hacking force. The NSA is one of the United States' primary intelligence agencies, focused specifically on signals, intelligence, and information security. Within this already specialized agency, there exists an even more specialized unit called Tailored Access Operations, or TAO. The name itself gives you a hint. Tailored means customized. Access means getting into systems that are supposed to be closed off. Operations means conducting missions. Put it together and you have a unit that creates custom solutions for accessing specific, protected computer systems. TAO's mission is straightforward to describe, but extraordinarily difficult to execute. They gather intelligence on computer systems. That means identifying targets, understanding how their systems work, finding vulnerabilities, developing exploits, deploying them without being detected, and extracting valuable intelligence. The people who work in TAO are among the best hackers in the world. They are experts in computer systems, networking, programming, and cryptography. Many have advanced degrees. They have resources most hackers could only dream about. Substantial budget, access to advanced technology, and most importantly, time. If TAO needs to spend 3 years researching a system and developing an exploit, they can do that. The tools in the ANT catalog we discussed earlier were TAO's work. The USB implants, the firmware backdoors, the iPhone exploits, all of it came from this unit. TAO has changed its name since our story takes place. The unit is now called Computer Network Operations. But for most of the time period we are discussing, they were known as TAO. When security researchers began noticing certain hacking campaigns that stood out for their technical excellence, they needed a way to refer to this group. They gave them a code name, the Equation Group. Over time, researchers became increasingly confident that the equation group was actually TAO. Jake Williams had spent nearly 2 decades working in the information warfare community. 5 of those years were spent specifically within Tao. During his time there, he would have had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence capabilities. He would have worked on operations targeting foreign governments and terrorist organizations. He would have used tools similar to those released in the shadow broker's dumps. This was not something Jake talked about publicly. When he left government service and founded Rendition InfoSec, he kept his TAO background quiet. There is a significant difference between saying you worked for the Department of Defense and saying you were a hacker for the NSA's elite cyber operations unit. Jake had kept this secret for good reasons. People who work in classified programs sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. The culture of secrecy runs deep. You learn not to discuss your work, not to hint at capabilities. Beyond the legal reasons, there are personal safety considerations. People who conduct cyber operations against foreign governments sometimes become targets themselves. When shadow brokers publicly identified Jake as a former equation group member, they shattered that carefully maintained privacy. Suddenly, Jake's background was public knowledge. Foreign intelligence services, who might have wondered about his background, now had confirmation. But shadow brokers did not stop there. In their messages, they included references to specific operations and programs. They mentioned things like odd jobs, CCI, Windows bits persistence, and the Q group. Jake could not comment on these references. He could not confirm or deny what they meant. Speaking about classified programs, even to say they do not exist, can itself be a violation. So when journalists asked about these references, Jake had to remain silent. Being publicly identified changed everything about how Jake had to think about his own security. Before, he was just another security professional. Afterwards, he was a known former NSA operator. This affected his career. Some clients might see his background as a valuable credential. Others might view it as a liability. Some international opportunities were now potentially dangerous. It affected his family, explaining to his ex-wife that he had been publicly identified by what appeared to be a Russian hacking group, that there were potential risks he could not fully quantify. It affected his sense of security and privacy. Suddenly, he had to think about who might be interested in him, who might be tracking him. The irony is that Jake had been doing exactly what security researchers are supposed to do. He had been analyzing threats, sharing his findings, helping people understand sophisticated adversaries. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply been doing his job well. But in the shadowy world of nation-state cyber operations, providing that kind of analysis can itself be seen as a threat. By connecting shadow brokers to Russian information operations, Jake had apparently crossed a line, and so they struck back with information. They weaponized Jake's own background against him. As Jake processed what had happened, one thing became clear. Shadow brokers had shown they had access to more than just tools and exploits. They had operational intelligence, and the biggest revelation was still ahead. Eternal Blue, the doomsday weapon. A few days after Jake Williams' world turned upside down, the shadow brokers released their most devastating weapon yet. They called it Eternal Blue, and it would go on to fuel some of the most destructive cyber attacks in history. Jake was still processing being publicly identified. He was dealing with the immediate fallout, the conversations with family, the uncertainty. He was teaching while running a fever. And then, just a few days later, on April 14th, 2017, shadow brokers delivered what would turn out to be their most significant dump yet. A collection of exploits that included two with particularly ominous names, Eternal Blue and Eternal Romance. Eternal Blue was designed to attack a component of Windows called SMB, which stands for Server Message Block. SMB is a network protocol that allows computers to share files, printers, and other resources. It is built into Windows. It comes installed by default on virtually every Windows computer. The fact that SMB is installed by default is what made Eternal Blue so dangerous. This was a fundamental component of Windows networking, present on hundreds of millions of computers around the world. Eternal Blue exploited a vulnerability in how SMB handled certain specially crafted messages. More technically, it took advantage of a buffer overflow vulnerability. An attacker could send more data than SMB was expecting, and that extra data could overflow into parts of the computer's memory where it should not be. What made this particularly powerful was that it was a remote exploit. You did not need physical access. You did not need to trick someone into clicking something. You just need to be able to send network traffic to the target computer's SMB service. The exploit allowed remote code execution. An attacker could run any program they wanted on the target computer. They had, in essence, complete control. Security researchers who analyzed the exploit were struck by its sophistication. This was clearly the work of experts. It was reliable. It was stealthy. It was, by all accounts, a masterpiece of exploit engineering. But here is where things get interesting. When shadow brokers released Eternal Blue in mid-April, security researchers found something unexpected. Microsoft had already patched this vulnerability. About a month earlier, in March, Microsoft had released a security update that fixed the SMB vulnerability. This timing was remarkable. The rumor that spread through the security community was that the NSA had given Microsoft a quiet heads up. The theory, the NSA knew shadow brokers had Eternal Blue. They could not stop the release, but they could at least ensure that a patch was available first. If this theory is true, it represents an interesting ethical calculation. The NSA had apparently kept this vulnerability secret for years, using it in their own operations. But when they realized it was about to become public, they chose to warn Microsoft. The existence of a patch did not mean everyone was safe. Patching takes time. Some organizations are quick, others are slow. Some systems might never get patched at all. So even with a patch available, there were still millions of vulnerable computers when Eternal Blue became public. And every hacker on Earth could now download this exploit. For Jake Williams, this release came at the worst possible time personally, but from a professional perspective, it demanded immediate attention. Clients needed to be warned. Networks needed to be assessed. Eternal Blue could affect essentially every version of Windows that people were actually using. The reach of this exploit was nearly universal. The sophistication sparked renewed debate about the NSA's practice of stockpiling zero-day vulnerabilities. Here was clear evidence of what could happen when these stockpiled exploits got loose. The NSA had apparently kept this vulnerability secret for years, but now it was in the hands of criminals and hostile nations. As April moved toward May, there was a sense in the community that something fundamental had shifted. The NSA's toolkit was now public. The most sophisticated hacking tools ever created were available for download. Jake continued his work, helping clients, teaching classes, but he did so with a new awareness of his own visibility, of his connection to this story. What no one knew yet was that Eternal Blue was about to be used in attacks that would cause damage on a scale never before seen. The weapon had been released, the instructions had been published, and the world was about to learn just how much damage could be done when an NSA-grade exploit fell into the wrong hands. A life in the crosshairs. Being publicly identified as an NSA hacker changes everything. The conference rooms you can enter, the countries you can visit, the conversations you can have with your own child, all of it transforms overnight. The morning Jake Williams woke to 99+ notifications marked a dividing line in his life. There was before, and there was after, and the after required learning to live with uncertainties he had never needed to consider. The first and most immediate concern was simple but profound. Who might this information put him at risk from? The obvious concern was Russia. If shadow brokers really were connected to Russian intelligence, then Russian services now had confirmation of something they might have only suspected before. Jake was a former NSA operator. He had likely been involved in operations against Russian targets. That made him interested in Russian intelligence. But beyond Russia, Jake had to think about every country where TEO might have conducted operations. Intelligence services around the world would be paying attention to shadow brokers' revelations. Any service that wanted to understand what the NSA had done would now have Jake's name on a list. There were also considerations that had nothing to do with foreign intelligence services. The political atmosphere was intensely polarized. Jake had publicly connected shadow brokers to Russian information operations. That had made some people angry. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part. Jake did not know who might be interested in him or why. He did not know if the threats were real or theoretical. But when you are dealing with potential nation-state threats, erring on the side of caution seems prudent. One of the first difficult conversations Jake had to have was with his ex-wife. They shared custody of their child, and suddenly, Jake needed to explain a situation that must have seemed almost incomprehensible. He had to call her and say that he had been publicly identified by what appeared to be a Russian hacking group, that there were risks he could not fully assess. Jake found himself giving his ex-wife a crash course in Russian intelligence services. She had not served in the military or intelligence community. She did not have the background to immediately understand the implications. So Jake explained. The conversation led to a decision that must have been painful. They agreed that for several weeks, maybe longer, Jake would not see his child in person. Instead, they would use video calls. They were separated by an abundance of caution about threats that might or might not be real. For several weeks, Jake and his child connected through video calls. The absurdity and the genuine concern existed side by side. Jake's business partner had a strong reaction to the attention Jake's blog post had generated. While Jake had seen his analysis as valuable, his partner saw risk. They were a small company without teams of lawyers. Drawing attention from nation-state actors could have consequences they were not prepared to handle. His partner made a decision. He took down Jake's blog post, the one connecting shadow brokers to Russian information operations. It was rewritten as a single paragraph of meaningless content. The analysis was gone. In a sense, shadow brokers had achieved their goal. They created enough concern that the post came down on its own. They weaponized information about Jake's background to intimidate him into silence. Jake also had to reconsider international travel. As a security consultant working with international clients, the ability to travel freely was important to his career. But now, every potential trip requires careful analysis. Jake had worked in TAO. He had likely been involved in operations targeting systems in various countries. Any country where TAO had conducted operations was potentially a country where Jake might face legal jeopardy. Jake had been scheduled to travel to Singapore. He cancelled that trip. Was it safe? Probably. But probably was not good enough when you are trying to assess whether you might be arrested at an airport. But there was an even more troubling aspect. The April Shadow Brokers dump had not just contained exploits like Eternal Blue. It had also included operational data, specifically information related to SWIFT banking transfers. This meant shadow brokers did not just have the NSA's tools. They had information about what the NSA had actually done. If shadow brokers had operational data, they might have information about what Jake specifically had worked on. And while they had revealed Jake's identity, they had not revealed the details of his operations. That information remained unspoken, hanging as an implicit threat. This created an ongoing state of uncertainty. Jake did not know what shadow brokers had. He did not know what they might release next. He was living with the knowledge that at any moment, more details about his past might become public. As spring moved towards summer, as the immediate shock began to fade into a new normal, Jake settled into a life that was fundamentally different. More cautious, more constrained, more aware of threats both known and unknown. He had become a character in the shadow broker's story, not just an analyst observing from a safe distance. The shadows that had exposed him had not gone away. They were still out there, watching, waiting, holding information that could reshape his life once again at any moment. The international threat. Every security conference invitation, every international contract, every airport, each one became a calculation. Not just where had Jake targeted, but where might someone want revenge? The world suddenly felt both larger and smaller to Jake Williams. Larger because he now had to think about geopolitics in ways that affected his personal safety. Smaller because the number of places he felt comfortable traveling had shrunk considerably. To understand why Jake felt this way, we need to talk about something the FBI maintains called the Cyber's Most Wanted list. Most people are familiar with the FBI's regular Most Wanted list, but fewer people know about the Cyber's Most Wanted, a specialized list of hackers the FBI has indicted. When the FBI investigates a hacking campaign and gathers enough evidence, they can seek an indictment. This is a formal criminal charge. Once someone is indicted, they become a wanted person. If they are overseas, the government can request extradition. The Cyber's Most Wanted list includes hackers from various countries. At the time of our story, The list included 11 hackers who worked for the Russian government, all indicted for their involvement in interfering with the 2016 elections. The list also included 4 Iranian hackers. This practice of indicting foreign government hackers is relatively new. It represents a shift in how the United States approaches these activities. Instead of treating cyber espionage purely as a matter between nations, the US began treating it as individual criminal activity. This creates an interesting precedent for someone in Jake's position. If the United States can indict Russian intelligence officers for conducting cyber operations against American targets, what prevents Russia from doing the same thing in reverse? The answer is nothing. If you accept that hacking on behalf of a government is an individual criminal act, then it cuts both ways. American government hackers become just as vulnerable to foreign indictments. Jake had to consider this reality seriously. He had spent 5 years working in TAO, conducting cyber operations on behalf of the United States. He had been following orders, but from the perspective of a country that had been targeted, he was a criminal hacker who had violated their sovereignty. If Russia decided to start indicting American intelligence officers, Jake had to assume he would be on that list. His name was already public. His affiliation with TAO was confirmed. The arrest of the Huawei executive in Canada demonstrated how these international legal mechanisms could work. Meng Wanzhou was arrested at Vancouver Airport in December 2018. The United States had issued an indictment against her. When she transited through Canada, Canadian authorities arrested her. She never even cleared customs. She was simply changing planes. But that was enough. The extradition treaty meant Canada was obligated to consider the American request. For Jake, the lesson was clear. Every time he considered international travel, he needed to think about extradition treaties, diplomatic relationships, and political calculations. The mental calculus became exhausting. If he flew to country X and country Y had an indictment against him, and country X had an extradition treaty with country Y, then the trip presented risks. Jake found himself having to play amateur geopolitical analyst every time a travel opportunity arose. Singapore is a wealthy, stable, technologically sophisticated nation. By most measures, it should be safe. But Jake cancelled his trip anyway, because probably is not the same as certainly. When the downside risk includes being arrested and potentially extradited, even a small probability feels too large. This kind of risk aversion has career costs. International consulting work pays well. Speaking engagements provide valuable networking. By limiting his travel, Jake was potentially limiting his career growth. Jake came to accept that this was his new reality. He would likely never know for certain which countries were safe. He would have to make decisions based on incomplete information. He also came to accept something else. He would not be surprised to be the first American intelligence officer indicted by a foreign nation for cyber operations. Or, if not the first, then certainly on the first list. This was not paranoia. It was a logical assessment based on his public exposure. Shadow brokers had identified him by name. If a foreign intelligence service wanted to build a case against American cyber operators, Jake was now a known quantity. The irony is that Jake had spent years serving his country, conducting operations that were lawful under American law and authorized by proper authorities. He had followed orders. He had simply done his job. But now, that service potentially made him a target. The operations he conducted might form the basis for criminal charges in other countries. In the absence of international consensus, individuals like Jake exist in a gray zone. They are not criminals under American law, but they might be criminals under other countries' laws, vulnerable to arrest if they end up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jake could not spend every day dwelling on all the things that might go wrong. He had a company to run, clients to serve, classes to teach, but the awareness was always there in the background, and perhaps most frustrating was the knowledge that he was largely at the mercy of decisions made by others. Shadow brokers could release more information at any time. Foreign governments could issue indictments whenever they chose. He had very little control. All he could do was make careful decisions and hope that would be enough. The world had become a chessboard, and Jake was a piece being moved by forces he could not see and could barely anticipate. The long silence. The silence was worse than the threats. After their devastating dumps in April 2017, after destroying Jake's privacy and releasing Eternal Blue, shadow brokers made one final tweet. And then they vanished. Not caught, not stopped, just gone. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The cybersecurity community kept waiting for the next shoe to drop, for the next dump, for the next person to be outed. The silence stretched on, and with it, the uncertainty. Were they done? Or were they just watching, waiting, learning who to target next? For Jake, the silence meant living in perpetual uncertainty. They could return at any moment. They could release more information about his operations. They could expose others. The sword hung over him, suspended by a thread he could not see. Security researchers checked shadow brokers' known accounts regularly, looking for any signs of activity. But the accounts remained dormant, the websites unchanged. As months stretched into a year, and then into 2 years, people began to wonder if shadow brokers had truly disappeared for good. Perhaps their work was done. Perhaps they had been shut down. Perhaps they had simply decided it was time to move on. The silence did not mean the story was over. The tools they had released continued to be used by hackers around the world. Eternal Blue, in particular, would power some of the most destructive cyber attacks in history. The exploits they had dumped remained effective on unpatched systems. The damage they had done would echo forward for years. But shadow brokers themselves had gone dark, and in their absence, the investigation into who they really were continued, though without any public breakthroughs. There were several theories about shadow brokers' identity. One theory was the insider threat scenario. Shadow brokers were someone who worked inside the NSA or for an NSA contractor, someone who had legitimate access to these tools and decided to steal them. The tools were highly classified, presumably protected by multiple layers of security. Getting them out would have been much easier for someone who already had access. Edward Snowden had proven that insiders could exfiltrate massive amounts of classified information. But there were problems with the pure insider theory. The way shadow brokers communicated, the way they timed their releases, the political messages they included all suggested more sophistication than you would typically see from a single insider acting alone. This led to a variation, the double agent scenario. Perhaps someone working for the NSA was actually working for another country, most likely Russia. This person provided the tools to their handlers. The Russian intelligence service then created the shadow broker's persona as a way to release these tools publicly while maintaining deniability. But by far the most widely accepted theory was that shadow brokers were working on behalf of Russia. The evidence was circumstantial but substantial. Start with the timing. Shadow brokers' dumps consistently coincided with periods when Russian cyber operations were prominent in the news. Every time the conversation turned to what Russia had done, shadow brokers would appear with a dramatic dump of NSA tools. This pattern happened too consistently to be coincidental. Then there were the political messages. Shadow brokers claimed to have voted for Trump. They addressed Trump directly. This was strange unless they had a reason to care about American politics in ways that aligned with Russian interests. The technical capabilities displayed also pointed toward a nation-state actor. They had managed to obtain highly classified NSA tools. They operated with strong operational security. They sustained their campaign over months. Perhaps most tellingly, shadow brokers demonstrated knowledge not just of the tools, but of operational details. They knew about Jake Williams' background. They knew about specific programs. This suggested access to personnel files, operational records, perhaps even surveillance of NSA personnel. All of these pieces of evidence created a strong circumstantial case that Russia was behind shadow brokers. Not proof, but a compelling theory. Yet despite all this evidence, despite years of investigation, there have been no public FBI indictments related to shadow brokers. No announcements of arrests. No formal attribution from the government. This is unusual. The FBI has been willing to indict foreign hackers in other cases. They have publicly attributed attacks to nation-states. But with shadow brokers, there has been silence from official channels. Perhaps the investigation is ongoing. Perhaps they know, but revealing what they know would compromise intelligence sources. Or perhaps the situation is more complicated than it appears. One explanation for this silence is that it would require admitting something uncomfortable. To publicly accuse Russia would be to publicly acknowledge that the NSA lost control of its most sensitive hacking tools. That kind of admission could damage America's reputation and credibility. The result is that the shadow broker story remains, even years later, a story without a definitive ending. We know what they did. We know the damage they caused. We can see the evidence suggesting who they might have been, but we do not have the satisfaction of a clear resolution. For Jake Williams, the lack of official resolution did not change his personal situation. Whether shadow brokers was definitively proven to be Russian, or whether the question remained officially open, he still had to live with the consequences of being outed. The cybersecurity community largely moved on. Shadow brokers had been a major story, but new threats emerged. The endless cycle of attack and defense continued. By the time 2 years had passed with no word from shadow brokers, most people assumed they were gone for good. Yet there remained an undercurrent of unease. Shadow brokers had not been caught. They had simply chosen to go silent, and that meant they could choose to return. They had done it before. The tools were out there. The damage was done. And somewhere, the individuals behind shadow brokers knew things about the NSA and its operations that had not yet been revealed. They held information that could further damage American intelligence capabilities, expose additional operations, or compromise more personnel. That information was a sword hanging by a thread, capable of falling at any moment. So the silence, while welcome after the chaos, was also unsettling. It was the quiet after a storm, but with the knowledge that storms can return. The mystery of shadow brokers remained unsolved, and unsolved mysteries have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them. The contractor who stole 50 terabytes. While the shadow brokers captured headlines, another story was unfolding quietly. A government contractor named Harold Martin III had managed to walk out of the NSA with 50 terabytes of classified information. Harold Martin was not a household name. He was, in many ways, an ordinary person living an ordinary life in suburban Maryland. But Harold Martin had a secret. Harold worked for Booz Allen Hamilton, the same contracting company that had employed Edward Snowden. Harold's job put him in contact with highly sensitive information. He had access to NSA systems and classified documents. And over a period of years, Harold began taking those secrets home with him. The scale of what Harold stole is difficult to comprehend. 50 terabytes of data. To put that in perspective, a typical laptop hard drive holds perhaps 1 terabyte. Harold somehow managed to accumulate 50 terabytes of classified information. How do you even move 50 terabytes out of a secure facility? You would need multiple external hard drives, or perhaps a large number of smaller storage devices over many trips. The logistics alone are staggering. And yet, Harold managed it. What was in all that data? The details have not been fully disclosed publicly, but we know it included NSA documents and information related to the agency's operations and capabilities. The question everyone asks is why? Was he planning to sell the information? Was he working for a foreign intelligence service? Was he trying to expose wrongdoing like Snowden? Unlike Snowden, Harold did not contact journalists. He did not release the documents publicly. He simply took the files and kept them. When authorities searched his home and car after his arrest, they found classified documents and storage devices, but no evidence he had shared the information with anyone else. Harold was arrested in August 2016, roughly the same time that shadow brokers made their first appearance. This timing immediately raised questions. Could Harold Martin be connected to shadow brokers? The theory had a certain appeal. Harold had access to NSA systems. He had been stealing classified information for years. The timing overlapped. If Harold had stolen TAO's hacking tools and passed that information to whoever was behind shadow brokers, it would explain how those tools got out. Investigators certainly looked into this connection, but no public evidence has emerged definitively connecting Harold Martin to shadow brokers. In October 2019, Harold was sentenced to 9 years in prison for willful retention of national defense information. That is a serious charge, but not the kind of sentence you would expect if prosecutors believed he had been actively spying. The charges suggested prosecutors believed he had stolen and kept the information, but had not passed it on to anyone. It was theft and unauthorized retention, but apparently not espionage. So if Harold Martin did not give the tools to shadow brokers, how did shadow brokers get them? This is where the theory runs into problems. The timing is suggestive, but not conclusive. It is possible that Harold and shadow brokers are completely unrelated. Perhaps Harold was stealing information for his own reasons, and meanwhile, someone else was obtaining the TAO tools through a completely different method. Sometimes, coincidences are just coincidences. It is also possible there were multiple insider threats at the NSA during this period. Harold was caught, but perhaps others were not. If one person managed to steal 50 terabytes, it suggests security procedures had significant weaknesses that others might have exploited. Or perhaps the tools got out through some method that had nothing to do with an insider at all. The possibilities are numerous. What the Harold Martin case does clearly illustrate is the reality and severity of the insider threat problem. The NSA is supposed to be one of the most secure organizations in the world, and yet a contractor managed to walk out with 50 terabytes of classified information over an extended period. Harold was not using advanced technical exploits. He was simply taking files he had legitimate access to and removing them from secure facilities. The security procedures failed. This points to a fundamental challenge in security. You can build the strongest walls in the world, but if you give people keys to get through those walls because they need access to do their jobs, those people become potential vulnerabilities. Edward Snowden had exploited this same weakness years earlier. He had legitimate access. The security systems did not stop him because he was doing things he was authorized to do. In the wake of both cases, the NSA implemented stronger insider threat programs. But these measures have their own challenges. Increase monitoring too much, and you create a culture of suspicion. The balance between security and operational effectiveness is delicate. For the purposes of understanding the shadow broker story, Harold Martin remains a possibility, a potential explanation for how the tools got out, but not a confirmed one. He had access, opportunity, and the pattern of stealing information. The timing aligns, but direct evidence connecting him to shadow brokers has not been made public. What we can say with certainty is that the NSA faced multiple serious security breaches during this period. Whether through Harold Martin, through shadow broker's source, or through other means, classified information and tools got out of what should have been one of the most secure environments in the world. It also serves as a reminder that no organization is immune to insider threats. The human element remains the most difficult to secure. Technology can be hardened, but people are complex and unpredictable. Harold Martin III sits in prison serving his 9-year sentence. He has largely faded from the headlines, but the questions his case raised about insider threats, about contractor oversight, about how to secure information when you must also grant access to it, those questions remain unanswered. The balance between security and operational necessity continues to be one of the hardest challenges facing intelligence agencies. And somewhere, perhaps, there are other Harold Martins working in secure facilities, and we will only know about them when it is too late to stop them. The NSA's dilemma. The shadow broker's dumps revealed something uncomfortable. Evidence that the NSA had been finding vulnerabilities in widely used software and keeping them secret. The question this raised would challenge the very mission of America's premier intelligence agency. The NSA has never officially confirmed that they created the tools shadow brokers released. But silence in the face of overwhelming evidence carries its own message. Every security researcher who analyzed the dumps came to the same conclusion. These tools bore all the hallmarks of sophisticated, professional development. They targeted specific systems with precise knowledge. They were well engineered, carefully tested, designed to avoid detection. The exploits worked. That is the most telling evidence. They were operational tools that could be deployed in real-world scenarios. When tested, they performed as advertised. Cisco, Fortinet, and Microsoft all confirmed that the vulnerabilities these exploits targeted were genuine, previously unknown to them, and required immediate patching. All of this points to one conclusion. These were NSA tools. The NSA's silence is, in essence, a form of confirmation through non-denial. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. What is the agency's mission? Is it to keep America safe by helping to secure our computer systems? Or is it to give America an advantage by developing capabilities to penetrate other countries' systems? These two missions are often directly in conflict, and at the center of this conflict is something called a zero-day vulnerability. Imagine a software developer creates a program. They test it carefully, but software is complex. Somewhere in that code, there is a flaw that allows someone who knows about it to make the software do things it was never intended to do. The software is released. Millions of people start using it. The developer does not know about the flaw. The users do not know about the flaw. But someone discovers it. They find this hidden weakness. Now comes the critical question. What do they do with that knowledge? If they are a responsible security researcher, they typically report the vulnerability to the software developer. This is called responsible disclosure. They give the developer time to create a patch. The goal is to make the software safer for everyone. But what if you are an intelligence agency? What if your job is to gather intelligence on foreign adversaries? That vulnerability might be incredibly valuable. You could use it to penetrate computer systems of targets your government cares about. If you report the vulnerability, it will get patched. Your targets will install the patch, and you will have lost a valuable capability. But if you keep the vulnerability secret, you are leaving millions of users vulnerable, not just to you, but to anyone else who might independently discover the same flaw. This is the zero-day dilemma. From the moment a zero-day is discovered, there is a choice: disclose it and make everyone safer, or hoard it and maintain an intelligence capability. The NSA has publicly stated that they do not hoard zero-day vulnerabilities. They have said they have a process for reviewing discovered vulnerabilities, and that the vast majority are disclosed to vendors. But the shadow brokers' dumps provided evidence that contradicts this public stance. Here were sophisticated exploits for widely used software, exploits that targeted vulnerabilities the software makers did not know about. The NSA had found these vulnerabilities and kept them secret so they could be used as intelligence weapons. Eternal Blue is the perfect example. This was an exploit for a vulnerability in Windows. The NSA apparently knew about it for years. They developed a sophisticated exploit for it. They used it in their operations, and they did not tell Microsoft. From the NSA's perspective, you can understand the logic. Windows is used everywhere. If you have a reliable way to compromise Windows systems, You have a capability that works against an enormous range of targets. Telling Microsoft means losing that capability. But from a broader security perspective, this decision looks different. Every day that vulnerability existed, every Windows computer was potentially at risk, not just from the NSA, but from anyone else who might discover the same vulnerability. Russian hackers, Chinese hackers, criminal groups, all of them are looking for vulnerabilities. Some of them are very good at it. The possibility that someone else might independently discover the same vulnerability is not theoretical. It happens. When that happens, suddenly everyone knows about the vulnerability, but no patch exists because the software maker did not know they needed to create one. This is what makes the NSA's decision controversial. They are gambling that they will be the only ones to find these vulnerabilities. When that gamble works, they maintain useful intelligence capabilities. But when it fails, the consequences can be catastrophic. With shadow brokers, the gamble failed spectacularly. All those carefully hoarded 0 days became public. Now everyone had them. The NSA's offensive capabilities became everyone's offensive capabilities. This gets to the fundamental tension between the NSA's two missions. One part is responsible for information assurance, for helping to secure American systems. Another part is responsible for signals intelligence, for penetrating adversaries' systems. The information assurance mission benefits from fewer vulnerabilities. The signals intelligence mission benefits from more vulnerabilities. These two missions pull in opposite directions. The NSA has chosen in practice, if not in public statements, to prioritize offense over defense. They have decided that the intelligence value of these capabilities outweighs the security risk of keeping vulnerabilities secret. The argument in favor of this choice: the NSA's primary mission is to protect national security by gathering foreign intelligence. That requires being able to penetrate adversaries' systems. If you give up that capability by disclosing all vulnerabilities, you blind yourself to threats. In a dangerous world, that intelligence capability is essential. But there is a powerful counter-argument. When the offensive capabilities get loose, when the exploits leak, the defensive benefits evaporate and the security costs become immediate and real. Every Windows computer became vulnerable when Eternal Blue leaked. And this was not the first time NSA capabilities had been exposed. Snowden leaked enormous amounts of information. The ANT catalog revealed specific tools. Now shadow brokers had dumped actual working exploits. There is a pattern here. Each exposure undermines the argument for hoarding vulnerabilities. If you cannot keep the vulnerabilities secret, if your tools end up getting leaked, then you have not actually gained a lasting intelligence advantage. You have temporarily had an advantage that eventually disappeared. The shadow brokers' dumps forced a conversation about this trade-off that the NSA would probably have preferred not to have. Privacy advocates and security experts had been arguing for years that intelligence agencies should disclose vulnerabilities. But the argument was somewhat theoretical. Now it was concrete. Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, wrote about this in the aftermath. He argued that governments hoarding vulnerabilities creates risks for everyone. When you create offensive capabilities, you have to secure them. When they get loose, they can be turned against anyone. The NSA's response has been limited, constrained by the fact that they cannot publicly discuss classified programs. They cannot explain their decision-making process in detail without revealing information about their operations. But the evidence speaks for itself. The tools were sophisticated. They targeted widely used software. They exploited previously unknown vulnerabilities. They were kept secret until shadow brokers released them. This brings us to a question that goes beyond the NSA specifically. Should intelligence agencies be in the business of hoarding vulnerabilities? Should they be finding flaws in the software we all use and keeping those flaws secret so they can exploit them? Or should they be helping to make that software more secure? There is no easy answer. It involves trade-offs between competing values: security versus intelligence capability, transparency versus operational secrecy, individual privacy versus national security. What the shadow broker story demonstrates is that the current balance has costs. Those costs were hidden as long as the NSA's capabilities remained secret. But when those capabilities became public, the costs became visible and undeniable. The debate continues to this day. Some argue for a much stronger bias toward disclosure. Others argue that intelligence capabilities are too important to give up. But one thing has become clear. The assumption that hoarded 0 days will remain secret is not a safe assumption. The NSA is a highly secure organization with enormous resources, and yet their tools got out. If the NSA cannot keep these capabilities secure, can anyone? Building weapons means you have to secure those weapons. And in the digital realm, stealing a weapon does not mean the original owner loses it. It means both the original owner and the thief have copies. The weapon proliferates. The NSA's dilemma is, in many ways, an unsolvable dilemma. Their mission requires capabilities. Capabilities require exploits. Exploits require keeping vulnerabilities secret. But keeping secrets in the digital age is extraordinarily difficult. And when the secrets get out, the very tools meant to protect national security can end up threatening it. The tools are out there. The vulnerabilities were eventually patched. The debate continues. And somewhere, intelligence agencies around the world are still finding 0 days, still making decisions about disclosure versus hoarding, still building offensive capabilities while hoping they can keep them secure. Lessons from the shadow. What defenders must know. When the NSA's tools fell into enemy hands, they became lessons. Expensive lessons, paid for by taxpayer dollars, now available for every security professional to study. The question was, what would we learn from them? The morning after shadow brokers released their dumps, security professionals around the world faced a choice. They could treat these releases as simply another security incident to patch against, or they could recognize this as an unprecedented opportunity to understand how the most sophisticated hackers in the world operate. The wise ones chose to learn. Jake Williams was among those who recognized the educational value. Yes, it was alarming that NSA tools were now public, but it also provided insight into capabilities that defenders had only been able to theorize about before. Let us return to the Windows Event Log Editor. Before shadow brokers, incident responders operated under certain assumptions about Windows logging. They knew administrators could clear logs entirely, but that would leave evidence. They believed individual events could not be surgically removed without leaving traces. These assumptions were based on publicly known capabilities, and they were wrong. The tool shadow brokers released proved that sophisticated attackers could disable logging without creating an event that said logging was disabled. They could delete individual events without leaving obvious gaps. For defenders, this was crucial information. The old techniques of relying primarily on Windows event logs as a trusted source of truth needed to evolve. One new method involved looking for what was not there. If event logs are numbered sequentially, and you see event 97, 98, then 100, the absence of event 99 tells you something. Someone manipulated the logs. Similarly, if you see a logout event but no corresponding login event, that is suspicious. Either the login event was never recorded or it was deleted. Defenders had to become suspicious of absences, of gaps, of things that should be there but were not. These mistakes become the new indicators of compromise that defenders need to watch for. The event log editor also taught defenders about the sophistication level they needed to prepare for. This was not a crude hack. This was a carefully engineered tool. If your adversaries have tools this sophisticated, your defenses need to match that sophistication. Every government hacking team in the world paid serious attention to these dumps. Intelligence services in Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Israel, the United Kingdom, France, and dozens of other countries all had their technical experts analyzing every file. They reverse engineered the exploits. They studied the techniques. They integrated the capabilities into their own toolkits. This is one of the most troubling aspects. The NSA had spent years and substantial resources developing these capabilities. In a matter of months, all of that investment became available to adversaries. Every sophisticated hacking team now had access to tools that had been exclusive to the NSA. For defenders in the private sector, the lesson was stark. The tools that nation-state actors use are not theoretical. They are real, they are sophisticated, and now they are available to anyone. A criminal ransomware operator could now simply download Eternal Blue and incorporate it into their malware. The democratization of elite hacking tools created new categories of threats. Years after the shadow brokers' dumps, security teams are still seeing attacks that use these tools. Eternal Blue, in particular, continues to power malware campaigns. Even though patches are available, there are still systems that have not been updated. This speaks to a persistent challenge. Knowing about a vulnerability and having a patch available is not the same as being protected. The patch has to be deployed. And in large, complex organizations, achieving complete patch coverage is extraordinarily difficult. So defenders have to assume that somewhere in their environment, there are probably unpatched systems. The question is not whether vulnerabilities exist, but how quickly you can detect and respond when they are exploited. This shift in mindset, from prevention only to detection and response, is one of the lasting impacts of shadow brokers on the security industry. Perfect prevention is impossible. You need robust capabilities for detecting when compromises occur and responding effectively. The shadow brokers' dumps accelerated the adoption of this mindset because they demonstrated so clearly that even the NSA could not keep its tools secure. If they were vulnerable, then every organization is vulnerable. Jake Williams and others in the incident response community used the shadow brokers' tools as training materials. They studied how the tools worked, practiced detecting them, and developed response procedures. This kind of hands-on familiarity with real adversary tools is invaluable. The tools also set a new baseline for what sophisticated means in cybersecurity. The dumps showed that the gap between nation-state capabilities and criminal capabilities was actually quite large. The engineering quality, the operational security considerations, the depth of system knowledge required, all of it demonstrated a level of sophistication most defenders had not fully appreciated. This raised the bar for what defenders need to be prepared for. You can no longer assume that attackers will make obvious mistakes. Sophisticated attackers use sophisticated tools. They understand how defenders think. They design their tools to evade detection. For security professionals, this means continuous learning and adaptation. The threat landscape is not static. What worked to defend networks 5 years ago may not work today. The shadow broker story is, in many ways, a story about the impermanence of secrets in the digital age. The NSA kept these capabilities secret for years. They invested enormous resources in developing and protecting them. And despite all that effort, the secrets got out. Once out, they spread instantly and globally. For defenders, this means preparing for a world where adversaries have access to sophisticated tools. It means assuming that any capability that exists will eventually be available to attackers. It means building defenses that do not rely on adversaries being less capable than they actually are. The irony is that the NSA's tools, once leaked, became valuable resources for the defender community. The agency that developed them for offensive purposes inadvertently provided defenders around the world with insight into how sophisticated attacks work. This is the silver lining. Yes, it was a catastrophic security breach. Yes, it exposed capabilities that should have remained secret. But it also educated a generation of security professionals about the realities of sophisticated threats. Jake Williams' perspective on this is particularly valuable. As someone who worked in TO and then became a defender, he occupies a unique position. He can see both sides. He knows what attackers are trying to do and what defenders need to do to stop them. His message has been consistent. Study these tools, understand them, learn from them. This knowledge is crucial for effective defense. The tools were developed with taxpayer money. In a strange way, now that they are public, citizens are getting a return on that investment. Security professionals can now learn from these tools and use that knowledge to improve their defenses. The cost was high, the damage was real, the security implications will last for years. But the knowledge is now out there, available to anyone who wants to learn from it. As we come to the end of this story, we find ourselves in a world fundamentally changed by shadow brokers. The tools are out there, the techniques are known, the sophistication has been demonstrated. Jake Williams continues his work, teaching, consulting, responding to incidents. He lives with the consequences of having been outed, with the travel restrictions and threat assessments that now define parts of his life. But he also continues to learn, to adapt, to help organizations defend themselves. The shadow brokers themselves have been silent for years. Whether they will return remains unknown, but their impact continues. Every attack using Eternal Blue, every investigation that must account for possible log manipulation, every security professional who studies those dumps to understand sophisticated adversary techniques. All of it traces back to those posts in 2016 and 2017. The story of shadow brokers is a story about secrets and how hard they are to keep. It is a story about the tension between offense and defense in cybersecurity. It is a story about how individual lives can be upended by forces operating at the level of nation-states. And it is a story about learning and adaptation, about taking even catastrophic breaches and finding in them lessons that can make us stronger. The digital world is forever changed by what shadow brokers revealed. The tools are out there, being used, being studied, being adapted, and security professionals like Jake Williams, armed now with knowledge of what they are defending against, continue their work. The shadow that these brokers cast is long and dark. But in that darkness, defenders have learned to see more clearly, to understand more deeply, and to defend more effectively. And in the end, that may be the most important lesson of all. When the weapon was used, 1 month after shadow brokers released Eternal Blue, the world discovered what happens when an NSA-grade exploit falls into the hands of criminals. On a Friday morning in May 2017, hospitals in the United Kingdom began shutting down, then factories in France, then universities in China. A weapon had been unleashed, and it was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. The date was May 12th, 2017. Just under a month had passed since shadow brokers had released Eternal Blue to the world. Security professionals had spent that month frantically patching systems, assessing vulnerabilities, and preparing for the attacks they knew were coming. Microsoft had released patches. Advisories had gone out. But in organizations around the world, countless computers remained unpatched, still vulnerable, still running the same version of Windows with the same SMB flaw that Eternal Blue could exploit. And on that Friday morning, someone decided to use it. The attack started in Europe, though later analysis would suggest it may have originated in Asia hours earlier, when fewer people were online to notice. The first reports came from the United Kingdom's National Health Service, the NHS. Hospitals began seeing their computer systems lock up. Screens displayed a message in red text on a dark background. Your files have been encrypted. To decrypt them, you must pay $300 in Bitcoin. You have 3 days before the price doubles. You have 7 days before your files are deleted forever. This was ransomware, malicious software designed to encrypt files on a computer and demand payment for the decryption key. Ransomware had existed for years, usually spread through phishing emails or compromised websites. But this ransomware was different. It did not need anyone to click anything. It did not need to trick users into running malicious files. It simply scanned networks, looking for computers running vulnerable versions of Windows. And when it found them, it used Eternal Blue to break in remotely. Within hours, the attack had spread to over 150 countries. Hospitals in the UK cancelled surgeries and turned away patients. Doctors could not access medical records. Diagnostic equipment stopped working. Ambulances were redirected to other facilities. The attack was not targeted at hospitals specifically. It was indiscriminate, spreading to any vulnerable computer it could reach. But when it hit healthcare systems, the consequences became immediately and terrifyingly visible. In Spain, Telefónica, one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world, saw its systems compromised. employees were told to shut down their computers and disconnect from the network. In France, Renault, the automobile manufacturer, stopped production at several factories. In Germany, Deutsche Bahn, the railway operator, saw displays at train stations replaced with ransom demands. In Russia, the Interior Ministry was hit, along with major banks and telecommunications companies. The malware had a name now. Security researchers were calling it WannaCry, after a name found in the code. And it was spreading exponentially, each infected computer scanning for new targets, finding them, infecting them, and then those newly infected computers scanning for more targets. It was a worm, self-replicating, self-propagating, moving through networks at a speed that made containment nearly impossible. Jake Williams watched this unfold from his office in Augusta, Georgia. His phone was ringing constantly. Clients were calling in a panic. Are we vulnerable? Have we been hit? What should we do? The Rendition InfoSec Security Operations Center had moved to crisis mode. Analysts were monitoring client networks, looking for any signs of the infection, checking whether patches had been deployed, conducting rapid assessments of exposure. For Jake, there was a particular irony to the situation. Eternal Blue, the exploit he had likely used during his time at TAO, the capability developed at enormous expense to gather intelligence on America's adversaries, was now being used by criminals to cause chaos worldwide. The tool meant to protect national security had been turned into a weapon that threatened hospitals and businesses and ordinary people. But there was something else about WannaCry that caught Jake's attention as he analyzed the attack. The ransomware itself was not particularly sophisticated. The encryption was standard. The ransom demand mechanism was crude. What made WannaCry devastating was Eternal Blue, the NSA exploit that allowed it to spread without human interaction. Strip away Eternal Blue, and WannaCry was just another piece of ransomware that would have infected a few dozen or few hundred computers through phishing emails. Add Eternal Blue, and it became a global crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of computers in a single day. By the end of that first day, security researchers estimated that over 200,000 computers in at least 150 countries had been infected. The numbers kept climbing. Organizations were scrambling to patch their systems, to disconnect vulnerable machines from networks, to restore data from backups where backups existed. In places where backups did not exist or had not been tested recently, the decisions were agonizing. Do you pay the ransom? Do you try to decrypt the files yourself? Do you accept the loss and rebuild? The attack had been partially slowed by an accidental discovery. A security researcher named Marcus Hutchins, who went by the handle Malware Tech, was analyzing the malware code when he noticed something unusual. Before encrypting files, WannaCry checked whether a specific domain name existed and was reachable. It was a long, seemingly random string of characters. If the domain did not exist, the malware would continue encrypting. But if the domain did exist, the malware would stop. This was apparently meant to be a check against analysis in sandboxes, isolated environments where security researchers study malware. Sandboxes often simulate internet connections and respond to all domain lookups as if the domain exists. The malware authors thought that if this random domain existed, they must be in a sandbox being analyzed, and they should stop to avoid revealing their behavior. But they had made a mistake. They had never actually registered this domain themselves. So Marcus Hutchins, trying to track where the infection was spreading, registered it. And suddenly, without intending to, he had activated what became known as a kill switch. New infections slowed dramatically. Computers that were already infected remained encrypted, but the worms stopped spreading as aggressively. It was a moment of accidental heroism. Marcus had not set out to stop a global cyber attack. He had simply been doing routine malware analysis. Following his curiosity about how the malware worked, but his action, registering that domain for about $11, had blunted one of the most widespread cyber attacks in history. Later, Marcus would describe feeling surreal about the whole thing. He had been sitting at his desk analyzing malware, as he did most days, and suddenly he was being called a hero who had saved the internet. But even with the kill switch activated, the damage was substantial. The NHS in the UK faced massive disruptions. An estimated 19,000 appointments were cancelled. 5 emergency rooms had to be closed. Ambulances were diverted. The attack cost the NHS an estimated £92 million, when accounting for the disruption, the response, and the recovery efforts. Beyond the immediate financial and operational impact, WannaCry had psychological effects that rippled through organizations worldwide. It demonstrated that critical infrastructure, including healthcare, was vulnerable to cyber attacks. It showed that an attack could spread globally in hours, could affect essential services, and could put lives at risk. The theoretical threats that security professionals had been warning about for years had suddenly become very, very real. Investigators immediately began trying to determine who was behind WannaCry. The ransom demands suggested financial motivation, but the execution was strange for a profit-focused operation. The attackers had set up only 3 Bitcoin wallets to receive payments, creating a bottleneck that made it difficult for victims to pay even if they wanted to. There was no reliable customer service, no way for victims to confirm their files would be decrypted after payment. Many organizations that paid the ransom never received decryption keys. This suggested the attackers were either incompetent at monetizing their attack, or money was not really the primary goal. Perhaps the attack was meant to cause disruption and chaos, with the ransom element serving as cover. Perhaps it was a test of capabilities. Perhaps it was sent out prematurely before the infrastructure for collecting ransoms was fully prepared. As intelligence agencies and security companies analyzed the code, patterns began to emerge. The malware had characteristics similar to code previously attributed to a group called Lazarus, believed to be connected to North Korea. Some of the code had Korean language strings. The techniques matched previous attacks attributed to Lazarus. In December of 2017, the United States would formally attribute WannaCry to North Korea, specifically to government-linked hackers. But regardless of who was behind it, the message was clear. Eternal Blue was now in the wild, being actively used by adversaries. The NSA's carefully developed capability had become a weapon available to anyone with moderate technical skills and malicious intent. Every unpatched Windows computer in the world was a potential target. Jake and security professionals like him spent weeks dealing with the aftermath of WannaCry. For some clients, it was straightforward. They had patched their systems after Microsoft released the update in March. They had defense in depth. network segmentation, backups. They were prepared. For others, it was a crisis. They had not patched. They had not prepared. They scrambled to respond. But even as organizations were recovering from WannaCry, even as the news coverage began to fade, even as life started returning to normal, security professionals knew something that kept them awake at night. WannaCry had been clumsy. It had a kill switch. It spread so rapidly and so visibly that it triggered immediate response. But what about the next attack? What about attackers who learned from WannaCry's mistakes, who did not include kill switches, who spread more slowly to avoid detection, who targeted more carefully to maximize damage? That answer would come just 1 month later. On June 27, 2017, Ukraine was celebrating Constitution Day. Banks, government offices, and many businesses were closed for the holiday. But in the technology departments of major companies, something strange was happening. Computers were rebooting unexpectedly, and when they came back up, they displayed a ransom message similar to WannaCry. This attack initially appeared to be more ransomware. It used Eternal Blue to spread, just like WannaCry. It demanded $300 in Bitcoin, just like WannaCry. Security researchers started calling it Petya, after an older piece of ransomware it resembled. Later, when they realized this was something new, they renamed it NotPetya. But as analysts dug deeper into NotPetya, they discovered something chilling. Unlike WannaCry, which was crude ransomware that actually could decrypt files if victims paid, NotPetya was not really ransomware at all. It was a wiper, malware designed to destroy data permanently. The ransom mechanism was a fake, a facade to make it look like a criminal operation when it was actually something far more sinister. NotPetya would encrypt files, but even if victims paid the ransom, even if they followed the instructions perfectly, their data could not be recovered. The malware had destroyed the decryption keys. There was no way to get the files back. This was not about money. This was about destruction. The attack started in Ukraine, spreading through a software update mechanism for a tax accounting program widely used by Ukrainian businesses. Someone had compromised the software company and pushed out an update that contained NotPetya. Thousands of Ukrainian companies installed what they thought was a legitimate update and instead infected themselves with destructive malware. From there, NotPetya spread globally, using Eternal Blue and other techniques to move across networks. But while WannaCry had been indiscriminate, NotPetya was more strategic in its initial targeting. It hit Ukraine hard, affecting banks, energy companies, airports, and the metro system in Kyiv. Government systems went down. The radiation monitoring system at Chernobyl was disabled, forcing manual monitoring. It was the most sophisticated and destructive cyber attack Ukraine had faced, and Ukraine had faced many since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. But NotPetya did not stay in Ukraine. It spread to multinational companies that had operations in Ukraine. And from those companies, it spread to their global networks. Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world, saw its entire global network compromised. Ports stopped functioning. Ships could not be loaded or unloaded. The company had to reinstall Windows on 4,000 servers and 45,000 computers. The attack cost Maersk up to $300 million. FedEx's European subsidiary TNT Express was hit, causing disruptions that would affect the company for months. The pharmaceutical giant Merck was hit, disrupting production and vaccine supplies. Law firms were hit. Advertising agencies were hit. The Russian state oil company Rosneft was hit, despite Russia being widely suspected as the source of the attack. The total damage from NotPetya was estimated at over $10 billion, making it the most destructive cyber attack in history at that time, and at its core, enabling the spread, making it possible for malware to leap across networks and borders and infect thousands of computers, was Eternal Blue, the NSA exploit that shadow brokers had released just 2 months earlier. Jake Williams watched NotPetya spread with a growing sense of dread. WannaCry had been bad, but NotPetya was worse. More targeted initially, but more destructive ultimately. More sophisticated in its execution, and clearly state-sponsored, clearly aimed at causing maximum damage to Ukraine while creating plausible deniability by making it look like ransomware. The US and UK governments would later formally attribute NotPetya to Russia, specifically to the Russian military. It was, they said, part of Russia's ongoing effort to destabilize Ukraine. The ransom element was covered. The real goal was destruction, chaos, and economic damage. But the attack had backfired spectacularly on Russia. By using Eternal Blue as one of its spreading mechanisms, by making the malware so aggressive in how it propagated across networks, NotPetya had escaped its intended targets and caused billions of dollars in damage worldwide, including to Russian companies. It demonstrated the challenge of containing cyber weapons once they are unleashed. You can aim them, but you cannot always control where they go. For Jake, and for many in the security community, these attacks raised uncomfortable questions. How many more attacks would use Eternal Blue? The exploit was now permanently in the wild. Even as systems got patched, new systems would be deployed. Legacy systems that could not be easily updated would remain vulnerable, and attackers now had a proven weapon that they knew worked on a global scale. There was also the larger question about the NSA's role in this disaster. If the NSA had disclosed the SMB vulnerability to Microsoft years earlier, when they first discovered it, would WannaCry and NotPetya have been possible? Probably not. Microsoft would have patched the vulnerability. The attack surface would have been much smaller. The exploits might never have been developed by other actors, but the NSA had chosen to hoard the vulnerability, to develop Eternal Blue, to use it in their operations. And when it leaked, the cost was not borne by the NSA alone. It was borne by the NHS, by Maersk, by Merck, by thousands of organizations and millions of people affected by attacks that used the NSA's own exploit against the world. Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, wrote a blog post comparing this to the military having Tomahawk missiles stolen. But he argued it was worse, because in the digital realm, stolen weapons do not disappear from the original owner's arsenal. They get copied, they proliferate, and they can be used by anyone. The WannaCry and NotPetya attacks marked a turning point in how seriously organizations took cybersecurity. The threats were no longer theoretical. The consequences were no longer abstract. Boards of directors started asking questions about patch management and business continuity and cyber insurance. Governments began treating cyber attacks as national security issues requiring coordinated response. The conversation had changed. Jake continued his work, but the context had shifted. Every time he taught a SANS class now, he could point to WannaCry and NotPetya as real-world examples of what happens when nation-state capabilities leak. Every time he responded to an incident, he checked for indicators of eternal blue. Every time he advised a client on priorities, the urgency was clearer because everyone had seen what could happen. The tools that shadow brokers had released, the capabilities that had been developed in secret at enormous expense, had now been used to cause over $10 billion in damage. Hospitals had been disrupted, supply chains had been interrupted, data had been destroyed, and somewhere, the individuals behind shadow brokers, whether they were Russian intelligence officers or someone else entirely, must have known what they had unleashed. They had given the world not just knowledge of the NSA's capabilities, but actual working exploits that could be used immediately, and the world had used them with devastating effect. As the summer of 2017 turned to fall, as organizations continued to recover and rebuild and patch their systems, as investigators continued trying to attribute the attacks and understand the full scope of the damage, one thing was certain. The shadow brokers' dumps had changed cybersecurity forever. The line between nation-state capabilities and criminal capabilities had blurred. The tools of espionage had become tools of destruction, and the world was still learning to cope with the consequences. Jake Williams, sitting in his office in Augusta, responding to yet another client crisis, teaching yet another class about the realities of modern cyber threats, could not help but reflect on the strange arc of his career. He had been part of the team that developed capabilities like Eternal Blue, working in secret to give America an intelligence advantage. Now he was part of the team trying to defend against those same capabilities, watching as they were used to cause chaos worldwide. The irony was not lost on him, nor was the weight of knowing that the decisions made in classified spaces, the tools developed in secret, could have consequences that rippled out to affect millions of ordinary people just trying to live their lives. The weapon had been used, the damage had been done, and the question now was what lessons would be learned, what changes would be made, whether this would finally force a reckoning with the practice of hoarding 0 days and building cyber weapons that could not be reliably controlled once they escaped into the wild. The answer to that question would unfold slowly over years as policymakers and security professionals and technology companies grappled with the implications of what had happened. But on those long summer days in 2017, watching WannaCry and NotPetya spread across the globe, the immediate reality was simply this: the world had changed, and there was no going back. The long shadow, legacy and lessons years have passed since that August morning when shadow brokers first appeared. The immediate crisis has faded into history, but the shadow they cast stretches forward still, shaping policy debates, changing how we think about security, influencing decisions made in classified spaces and corporate boardrooms alike. And for Jake Williams, life continues in that shadow, different from what it was before, forever marked by those events. It is now several years later. The exact date does not matter so much anymore. What matters is that enough time has passed for patterns to emerge, for lessons to be learned, for the long-term consequences of the shadow broker's dumps to become visible. The story has moved from breaking news to history, from immediate crisis to studied analysis, from panic to understanding. But the changes it brought remain. Jake Williams still runs Rendition InfoSec from Augusta, Georgia. He still teaches SANS courses, though now, when he mentions the shadow brokers, dumps in his presentations. Students who were in high school when it happened are sitting in his classes. He still responds to incidents, though the threat landscape has evolved in ways that trace directly back to those dumps. He is still Malware Jake on Twitter, though his following has grown as his story became known. He is still that same person, and yet fundamentally changed by everything that happened. The travel restrictions that once defined his life have gradually relaxed, not because the threats disappeared, but because Jake learned to assess and manage them, learned which risks were real and which were theoretical, learned to live with a certain level of uncertainty that once seemed intolerable. He still thinks carefully about international travel and still evaluates each opportunity against potential risks. But he has found ways to do the work he needs to do, to maintain the career he has built, to live a life that is constrained but not paralyzed. His relationship with his child, disrupted so traumatically during those first weeks after being outed, has been rebuilt. The video calls gave way to supervised visits, which gave way to normal custody arrangements, which gave way to something approaching the relationship they had before, though marked by conversations about security and risk that most parents never need to have with their children. There is a resilience in family bonds, Jake has learned, a capacity to adapt to changed circumstances that mirrors the resilience of the systems he helps defend. The security community has evolved as well, shaped by the lessons of shadow brokers in ways both visible and subtle. The dumps forced a maturation in how the industry thinks about nation-state threats. Before shadow brokers, there was a tendency to treat advanced persistent threats as something separate from everyday security concerns, something that only affected high-value targets, something that most organizations did not really need to worry about. After shadow brokers, after WannaCry, and NotPetya demonstrated that nation-state capabilities could be used in indiscriminate attacks affecting anyone, the comfortable separation vanished. Security frameworks have changed. The NIST cybersecurity framework, used by organizations worldwide, has been updated to reflect lessons learned from these incidents. The emphasis has shifted more toward detection and response, acknowledging that prevention alone is insufficient. The concept of assuming breach has become mainstream, the idea that you must plan for compromise and focus on minimizing damage rather than believing you can prevent all attacks. The vulnerability disclosure debate has intensified. Before shadow brokers, the argument about whether intelligence agencies should hoard 0 days or disclose them to vendors was largely theoretical, confined to policy papers and academic debates. After shadow brokers, the costs of hoarding became concrete and undeniable. This has not resolved the debate, but it has changed its terms. Those arguing for disclosure can point to WannaCry and NotPetya and ask whether intelligence value was worth $10 billion in damage. Those arguing for maintaining capabilities can point to intelligence successes achieved using these tools before they leaked. But no one can deny anymore that the choice has real consequences. In the United States, this led to the creation of something called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process, or VEP. This is a formal interagency process for deciding when vulnerabilities discovered by intelligence agencies should be disclosed to vendors versus retained for intelligence or defensive use. The process existed in informal ways before, but the shadow brokers' dumps forced it to become more rigorous, more transparent, more accountable. The VEP establishes criteria for decision-making. How widely is the vulnerable product used? How severe is the vulnerability? What is the intelligence value of the exploit? Are there other ways to achieve the same intelligence goal? How likely is it that adversaries will discover the same vulnerability independently? These factors are weighed, and a decision is made, ideally balancing national security needs with the security of the broader digital ecosystem. But the VEP is not perfect, and critics point out its limitations. The process is still classified. There is no public reporting on how many vulnerabilities are retained versus disclosed. There is no independent oversight. And ultimately, the decision makers are the same agencies that benefit from retaining vulnerabilities, creating an inherent conflict of interest. The VEP represents progress, but the fundamental tension remains unresolved. Internationally, other countries have grappled with similar questions. The United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and others have established their own versions of vulnerability disclosure processes. The conversations happen in different languages and different policy contexts, but the core dilemma is the same everywhere. How do you balance the intelligence value of exploits with the security risk of keeping vulnerabilities secret? The shadow broker story has also influenced how technology companies think about security. Microsoft, burned by seeing its vulnerabilities exploited in WannaCry and NotPetya, has become more aggressive about security. The company now offers a bug bounty program that pays researchers to find and report vulnerabilities. They have created a digital crimes unit that works with law enforcement to take down malware operations. They have advocated publicly for norms around cyber operations and against government hoarding of vulnerabilities. Other technology companies have followed similar paths. Google, Apple, Facebook, and others have enhanced their security programs, increased bug bounty rewards, and published transparency reports about government requests for data and information. There is a growing recognition in the technology industry that security is not just a technical problem, but a business imperative and a social responsibility. The shadow brokers' dumps have become a standard case study in cybersecurity courses at universities worldwide. Students analyze the tools that were released, study the attacks that used them, debate the ethics of vulnerability disclosure, and consider the human impact on people like Jake Williams. The story touches on technical details, policy questions, ethical dilemmas, and personal consequences, making it rich material for education. Jake himself has become something of an expert witness to history. He is regularly asked to speak at conferences about his experience, to provide perspective on nation-state threats, to explain how defenders should think about sophisticated adversaries. There is a certain irony in having been outed against his will and then choosing to speak publicly about that experience. But Jake has found meaning in it, a way to take something that happened to him and use it to help others understand the landscape they are operating in. When Jake speaks about shadow brokers now, he emphasizes several key lessons. First, operational security is never perfect. The NSA, with all its resources and expertise, lost control of its most sensitive tools. If it can happen to them, it can happen to anyone. This should instill humility in security professionals, a recognition that we are all vulnerable, that our defenses are never as strong as we think they are. Second, insider threats are real and severe. Whether shadow brokers got their tools through an insider, through a sophisticated hack, or through some other means, the NSA clearly had weaknesses in how it protected its capabilities. Organizations need to think seriously about insider risks, about how to detect and prevent them, about how to limit the damage if they occur. This is not about creating cultures of suspicion, but about implementing reasonable controls and monitoring. Third, that the line between offense and defense in cybersecurity is not as clear as it might seem. The same vulnerabilities that enable intelligence operations create risks for everyone. The tools developed for offensive purposes can leak and be turned against the organizations that created them. This has implications for how governments think about cyber operations, how they make decisions about developing capabilities, how they balance competing interests. Fourth, transparency and accountability matter. The shadow brokers' dumps happened in secret. The NSA's decision to hoard 0 days was made in classified spaces. The public had no visibility into these decisions until the consequences became visible through WannaCry and NotPetya. Jake argues that while some classification is necessary, there needs to be more transparency about the processes and principles governing these decisions, more accountability to ensure that short-term intelligence gains are weighed against long-term security risks. Fifth, that human costs matter. When we talk about cybersecurity, we often focus on technical details, on exploits and vulnerabilities and patches. But behind all of this are real people whose lives are affected, patients whose surgeries were cancelled because of WannaCry, employees who lost their jobs because NotPetya destroyed their company's data, and people like Jake, whose privacy was violated, whose safety was threatened, whose life was fundamentally changed by forces beyond their control. These human dimensions need to be part of how we evaluate policies and make decisions. The shadow brokers themselves remain mysterious. Years have passed with no word from them. No new dumps have appeared. The Twitter accounts remain dormant. The websites are unchanged. Whether they achieved whatever goals they set out to achieve, whether they were shut down by authorities, whether they simply decided to go silent, remains unknown. The lack of public attribution from the US government remains conspicuous. The FBI has indicted North Korean hackers for WannaCry. They have indicted Russian military officers for NotPetya. But for shadow brokers, for the original leak that made both attacks possible, there have been no public indictments, no formal attribution, no announcements of arrests or charges. This silence suggests several possibilities. Perhaps the investigation remains ongoing, still gathering evidence, still building a case. Perhaps the government knows who was behind shadow brokers, but cannot prove it in ways that would support prosecution. Perhaps revealing what they know would compromise sources or methods that need to remain protected. Perhaps the truth is more complicated than the simple Russia attribution that most security professionals believe, and the government is not ready to reveal that complexity publicly. Or perhaps there is a strategic decision to maintain ambiguity. By not formally attributing shadow brokers, the government avoids having to acknowledge definitively that the NSA's capabilities were compromised and leaked. It avoids having to explain how such a catastrophic breach could have occurred. It avoids triggering expectations for response or retaliation. Sometimes, in the murky world of intelligence and cyber operations, silence is a strategy. For Jake, the lack of closure on who was behind shadow brokers is just another uncertainty to live with. He has his own theories, based on his analysis of the timing and the techniques and the operational patterns. But theories are not proof. And even if the truth was revealed tomorrow, it would not change his fundamental situation. He was outed. His background became public. His life changed. Those facts remain regardless of who was behind it or why they did it. There are nights when Jake wonders about the people behind shadow brokers. Are they still out there, watching the consequences of what they did? Do they see the news about WannaCry and NotPetya and feel any responsibility for the damage? Do they think about the hospital patients affected by WannaCry, the workers who lost their jobs because of NotPetya? Or do they see it all as just moves in a larger game, collateral damage in strategic operations between nations? Jake wonders too about his former colleagues at TAO, the people still working there, developing capabilities, conducting operations. How did the shadow brokers' leaks affect them? Did they have to change their operations, develop new tools, find new vulnerabilities? Did they feel betrayed by whoever leaked the tools? Did they feel responsible for the attacks that used their exploits? These are not conversations Jake can have, not questions he can ask. Those relationships ended when he left government service, and the classification that surrounds that work prevents the kind of candid reflection that might provide understanding. But Jake has found a kind of peace with the uncertainty, with the unanswered questions, with the ongoing risks and constraints. Life continues, work continues, the world keeps spinning, the digital infrastructure keeps functioning, defended by thousands of security professionals, maintained by millions of systems, used by billions of people. The threats are real, but so are the defenses. The vulnerabilities exist, but so do the patches. The attackers are sophisticated, but so are the defenders. There is a rhythm to security work that Jake has learned to find comfort in. The cycle of vulnerability discovery and disclosure, of patch development and deployment, of attack and response, of learning and adaptation. It is never finished, never complete, never perfect, but it moves forward. Progress happens incrementally. Systems get more secure over time, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through countless small improvements, through lessons learned from each incident, through knowledge shared across the community. The shadow broker story is now part of that collective knowledge, part of the shared history of the security community. It is studied, discussed, referenced, learned from. The tools that were leaked have been analyzed exhaustively. The techniques have been documented. The defenses have been developed and deployed. What was once secret NSA capability is now openly understood by security professionals worldwide. There is a certain justice in that, Jake thinks sometimes. The tools were developed with public money, funded by taxpayers. And now, through an unexpected and certainly unintended path, that knowledge has been returned to the public, not in the way anyone would have chosen, not without significant cost, but the result is that defenders worldwide now understand these capabilities and can protect against them. The NSA's advantage has been neutralized, but the security community's knowledge has been enhanced. As Jake teaches his next SANS class, as he responds to his next incident, as he analyzes the next sophisticated malware sample, he carries this story with him. It is part of who he is now, woven into his identity as a security professional and as a person. He is the man who was outed by shadow brokers. He is the analyst who connected their dumps to Russian information operations. He is the former TAO operator who now defends against the capabilities he once helped develop. But more than any of those specific roles, he is someone who has lived through a moment in history when the secret capabilities of intelligence agencies became public knowledge, when the tools of espionage became weapons of chaos, when the digital world was forced to confront the reality that secrets cannot be kept forever and that the weapons we build can be turned against us. He has seen the best and worst of cybersecurity, has experienced both the power of these tools and the consequences of their misuse. And he carries that knowledge forward, using it to help others, to improve defenses, to contribute to a more secure digital world. The story of shadow brokers is not really over. It continues in the policies shaped by their leaks, in the defenses developed to counter the exploits they released, in the careers of people like Jake who were forever changed by their actions. It continues in every organization that patches their systems more promptly because of WannaCry, in every security operations center that monitors more carefully because of NotPetya, in every policy discussion about vulnerability disclosure that references the NSA's lost tools. And it continues in the silent spaces too, in the classified briefing rooms where intelligence officials weigh the value of newly discovered vulnerabilities, in the decision-making processes that determine what gets disclosed and what gets retained, in the operational planning that must now account for the reality that capabilities can leak and be turned against their creators. The shadow brokers may be silent, but their influence echoes through every level of the cybersecurity ecosystem. As you drift towards sleep, as this long story finally draws to its close, consider what the shadow brokers saga teaches us about the digital world we inhabit. It teaches us that secrets are hard to keep, that powerful tools can escape control, that the consequences of decisions made in classified spaces can ripple out to affect millions of ordinary people. But it also teaches us about resilience, about the human capacity to adapt to new threats, about the power of knowledge and transparency and collective effort to solve hard problems. The digital world is complex and sometimes frightening, full of sophisticated threats and determined adversaries. But it is also full of dedicated professionals working to make it more secure, of researchers sharing knowledge to help everyone defend better, of organizations learning from mistakes and improving their practices. The balance between offense and defense shifts constantly, but the work continues, the progress persists, the systems adapt and evolve. And individuals like Jake Williams, marked by history but not broken by it, continue their work as well, teaching and learning, defending and responding, living with uncertainty but not paralyzed by it, finding meaning in the work itself, in the contribution made, in the knowledge shared. There is something deeply human in that persistence, in that refusal to be defeated by circumstances, in that commitment to keep moving forward even when the path is unclear and the destination unknown. The shadow that shadow brokers cast is long, stretching from that August morning in 2016 forward through years to come. But shadows only exist in the presence of light. And in the cybersecurity community, in the dedicated professionals working to defend digital systems, in the researchers finding and fixing vulnerabilities, in the educators sharing knowledge with the next generation, in people like Jake Williams, who transform personal adversity into collective wisdom, there is light. The work continues, the defenses hold, mostly, and life goes on. In all its complexity and uncertainty and resilience, rest now, knowing that while threats are real, so are the defenses. While the digital world has vulnerabilities, it also has protections. While individuals like Jake sometimes find their lives upended, they also demonstrate remarkable capacity to adapt and continue. The story of shadow brokers is remarkable and significant, but it is not the end of the story of cybersecurity. It is a chapter, important and transformative, but ultimately just one chapter in an ongoing narrative about humans and technology, about security and risk, about the choices we make and the consequences we live with. Tomorrow will bring new chapters, new challenges, new stories. But tonight, this chapter ends. Reflections in the digital dark. And so we come to the end of our journey through one of the most remarkable stories in the history of cybersecurity. We have traveled from the revelation of the ANT catalog in 2013 to the shadow brokers dumps of 2016 and 17. We have met Jake Williams, a man whose life was forever changed by forces he could neither control nor predict. We have examined tools that were meant to remain secret, but became known to the world. As you lie there, perhaps drifting towards sleep, let us take a few moments to reflect on what this story means. The shadow broker's story is, at its heart, a story about trust. We trust that the software we use is secure. We trust that the organizations protecting our digital infrastructure are competent and careful. We trust that secrets can be kept when they need to be kept. And the shadow broker story shows us how fragile that trust can be. But it is also a story about resilience. When the tools leaked, when Jake Williams found his identity exposed, life continued. Patches were developed. Defenses were strengthened. Jake adapted. The cybersecurity community learned and evolved. There is something reassuring in that resilience, a reminder that humans have always faced new challenges and found ways to adapt. Think about the complexity of the world we have explored together. A world where intelligence agencies employ thousands of people to find vulnerabilities in software used by millions. Where contractors can walk out of secure facilities with terabytes of classified information. Where mysterious groups can appear on the internet, release sophisticated hacking tools, and then vanish into silence. Where a single exploit can affect hundreds of millions of computers. It is a world that is simultaneously more connected and more vulnerable than any that has existed before. The same networks that allow us to communicate instantly with people on the other side of the planet also create pathways for those who would do harm. The tools that connect us can be used against us. The systems we rely on have weaknesses we may not understand until they are exploited. This duality is worth contemplating as you settle into rest. Technology is neither good nor evil. It is a tool that amplifies human intentions, whether those intentions are constructive or destructive. The same encryption that protects your private messages also protects criminals. The same networks that enable commerce also enable theft. The same code that powers innovation also creates vulnerability. The shadow broker's story shows us that trying to maintain exclusive control over these capabilities is difficult, perhaps impossible in the long term. The NSA's tools got out despite enormous resources devoted to keeping them secure. Once out, they spread instantly to every corner of the globe. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle. This is perhaps one of the defining characteristics of information in the digital age. Once released, it cannot be unreleased. Once known, it cannot become unknown. This raises questions about how we structure security in a digital age. If secrets cannot be reliably kept, if tools and techniques inevitably leak, if exclusive capabilities eventually become common knowledge, then perhaps our approach needs to change. Perhaps we need to focus less on maintaining advantages through secrecy and more on building resilient systems that can withstand attacks even when the adversary has sophisticated tools. The shadow brokers' dumps forced many organizations to confront this reality. You cannot prevent every attack. You cannot patch every system instantly. What you can do is prepare to detect attacks quickly, respond effectively, contain damage, and recover operations. This shift from prevention to resilience represents a maturation in how we think about security, an acceptance that perfection is impossible, but preparedness is achievable. Consider also the human dimension of this story. Jake Williams is not a fictional character. He is a real person who lived through these events and continues to live with their consequences. When we hear about cybersecurity incidents in the news, it is easy to think of them as abstract, as stories about organizations and systems and data. But behind every major security incident are real people whose lives are affected. For Jake, being outed meant changed relationships with family, restricted travel, ongoing threat assessments, and living with uncertainties about what information might be released next. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine waking each morning not knowing if today will be the day when more details of your past become public. Imagine having to explain to your child why you can only see them through a screen for a while. Not because you want to, but because the world has become too uncertain, too dangerous. Every security professional who responds to incidents, who investigates breaches, who tries to defend networks against sophisticated attackers, carries stress and responsibility that most people never think about. They see the darker side of technology. They understand the vulnerabilities most of us never consider. They carry the burden of knowing just how fragile our digital infrastructure really is, while also being unable to share that knowledge widely for fear of causing panic or revealing defensive strategies. The work they do matters. It matters for businesses trying to protect their data and serve their customers. It matters for governments trying to secure critical infrastructure that keeps society functioning. It matters for individuals whose personal information, whose financial data, whose private communications might be at risk in a breach. But it is work that is often invisible until something goes wrong. And then the focus is usually on the failure rather than on all the times the defense is held. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps spare a thought for those who work in the shadows to keep systems secure. The analysts in security operations centers, watching screens through the night shift, monitoring for anomalies, investigating alerts that are usually false positives, but sometimes represent real threats. The incident responders who get called when breaches are discovered, who drop everything, who work 70-hour weeks during a crisis, who piece together what happened from fragments of evidence, the researchers who study malware and exploits, who find vulnerabilities and help get them fixed, who share knowledge with the community so that everyone can defend better. These are people doing difficult work in a field where you are constantly playing catch-up with adversaries, where every defense eventually faces new attacks, where the threats evolve faster than the solutions. It is work that requires constant vigilance, endless learning, and a certain acceptance that you will never fully win, that the game is perpetual, that the best you can hope for is to stay ahead enough, to be prepared enough, to respond quickly enough when breaches inevitably occur. The Shadow Broker story also reminds us that in the digital age, the line between war and peace is blurrier than it once was. Nations conduct cyber operations against each other continuously, operations that fall somewhere between espionage and attack, between intelligence gathering and sabotage. These operations happen in a grey zone where the rules are unclear, where international law has not caught up to technological reality, where actions that would be considered acts of war in the physical world are treated as normal intelligence activities in the digital realm. When is a cyber operation an act of war? When does hacking become aggression that demands response? How should nations respond to cyber attacks from other nations when those attacks do not cause physical damage, but do cause economic harm or compromise sensitive information? These questions do not have settled answers. International law is still catching up to the realities of cyber conflict. Norms are still being established through practice and precedent. And in the meantime, operations continue, tools are developed, capabilities are deployed, and sometimes those capabilities leak and the world changes in ways that no one fully anticipated. Living in this world requires a certain comfort with ambiguity. We do not always know who is behind attacks. We do not always know the full extent of what was compromised. We do not always know what capabilities adversaries have or how those capabilities might be used against us. We make decisions with incomplete information, assess risks we cannot fully quantify, and prepare for threats we cannot entirely anticipate. This too is not unlike life in general. We all live with uncertainty. We all make decisions without complete information. We all face risks we cannot entirely control. The digital dimension of modern life adds new layers to this uncertainty. New types of risks that our ancestors never had to consider. New adversaries operating at scale and speed that were unimaginable in earlier eras. But the fundamental human challenge of living with uncertainty while still moving forward, still taking action, still building and creating and connecting. That challenge remains constant across all eras of human history. There is something almost meditative about contemplating these large-scale digital systems and the complex interactions between attackers and defenders, between nations and individuals, between secrecy and transparency. It is like watching waves on the ocean, patterns that are constantly changing but also somehow constant, chaos that has structure. If you look closely enough, complexity that can be understood if you approach it with patience and attention. Each wave is unique, but they all follow the same fundamental dynamics. Each cyber operation is different, but they all follow patterns that can be studied and understood and defended against. The tools shadow brokers released will eventually become obsolete. Software will evolve. New versions will be released. The specific vulnerabilities those exploits targeted will be patched, and the systems that were vulnerable will be upgraded or replaced. In the long arc of technology, these particular exploits will become historical curiosities, artifacts of a particular moment in time when certain systems had certain flaws and certain organizations had capabilities to exploit those flaws. But the lessons will remain. The questions about how to balance security and capability, about whether to disclose or hoard vulnerabilities, about how to protect secrets in a connected world, about how to conduct intelligence operations in ways that do not ultimately make everyone less secure. These questions will persist. New tools will be developed. New exploits will be found. New shadow brokers, perhaps under different names and from different sources, may emerge to release new leaks. The cycle continues because the underlying dynamics that created this situation remain largely unchanged. And that is okay. It is the nature of security to be an ongoing process, not a destination. You never achieve perfect security and then stop working on it. You are always adapting, always learning, always preparing for new threats while responding to current ones. It is a marathon with no finish line, a game with no final score, a conversation that never truly ends. And in that perpetual motion, in that constant adaptation, there is a kind of stability. The work continues, the vigilance persists, the defenders keep defending. For those of us who are not cybersecurity professionals, who are simply people trying to live our lives in a digital world, the Shadow Broker's story offers its own lessons. It reminds us to be thoughtful about the technology we use and the data we entrust to systems we do not fully understand or control. It suggests that we should maintain a certain healthy skepticism about claims of perfect security, about assurances that our data is safe, about promises that privacy is protected, not because we should live in fear, but because we should live with awareness. But it also shows us that systems can be remarkably resilient. When vulnerabilities are discovered, patches are developed, often very quickly. When breaches occur, they are investigated and contained. Damage is limited. Lessons are learned. When tools leak, defenses adapt. New detection methods are developed. New protective measures are put in place. The sky did not fall when shadow brokers released the NSA's exploits. The internet did not collapse. Critical infrastructure kept functioning. Life continued, perhaps a bit more carefully, perhaps with heightened awareness, but it continued nonetheless. This resilience is worth remembering as you drift off to sleep. The systems we depend on are watched over by people who care deeply about keeping them secure. When problems are discovered, they are addressed. When attacks happen, they are responded to. The work continues, day and night, around the clock, around the world. It is imperfect work done by imperfect humans in an imperfect world. But it is work that matters profoundly, and it is work that largely succeeds in keeping the digital infrastructure that modern life depends on functioning and relatively secure. Think about Jake Williams, continuing his work years after being outed by shadow brokers. He still teaches classes to rooms full of students eager to learn about security. He still responds to incidents when organizations discover they have been breached. He still helps companies defend their networks against the very kinds of tools he once helped develop. He adapted to new circumstances, assessed his risks, made adjustments to his life, and kept moving forward. There is a lesson in that perseverance, in that refusal to be paralyzed by fear or uncertainty, in that commitment to continue doing meaningful work even when the personal costs are high. Think about all the security professionals who studied the shadow brokers' dumps, who spent hours and days analyzing the code, understanding the techniques, documenting the capabilities, and then sharing that knowledge with the broader community. They took a negative event, a catastrophic breach of some of the most sensitive capabilities ever developed, and extracted value from it. They transformed leaked offensive tools into defensive knowledge. They used what was meant to harm to instead strengthen defenses. There is a lesson in that ability to learn from adversity, to find opportunities even in crises, to take what is broken and build something better from the pieces. The world of digital security is complex and sometimes frightening when you look closely at all the threats and vulnerabilities that exist, at all the ways systems can be compromised and data can be stolen and privacy can be violated. But it is also a world where many people work diligently and often thanklessly to make things better, to find problems before they are exploited, to share knowledge so that everyone benefits, to respond when things go wrong. It is a world where knowledge is shared freely within the security community, where researchers publish their findings, where defensive techniques are documented and distributed, where progress happens incrementally but steadily through the collective efforts of thousands of dedicated professionals. As you settle into sleep, let these thoughts provide a measure of comfort. The systems you interact with daily, the websites you visit, the apps you use, the networks you rely on, they are imperfect, but they are also defended. They are vulnerable, but they are also resilient. They can be compromised, but they can also be secured, can recover from attacks, can be made stronger through the lessons learned from each incident. The digital world is not a perfect place, but it is a world where good people are working hard to protect what matters. The shadow broker story, for all its drama and intrigue, is ultimately a story about human beings trying to solve difficult problems in a complex world. Some, like those who worked in TIO, are trying to gather intelligence to protect their nations from threats. Some, like Jake Williams in his current role, are trying to defend networks and help organizations stay secure. Some, like the journalists who covered this story, are trying to understand what happened and inform the public. Some, like the software developers at Microsoft and Cisco and other companies, are trying to build secure products and fix vulnerabilities when they are found. All of them are navigating uncertainty, making decisions with incomplete information, and doing the best they can with the knowledge and resources available to them. There is something deeply human in all of this, something that transcends the technical details and the geopolitical context and the sophisticated tools and exploits. We are all trying to navigate uncertainty. We are all making decisions that matter, even if our decisions are not about national security or cyber operations. We are all balancing competing priorities, weighing risks against benefits, trying to protect what is important to us while still taking the chances necessary to move forward, to grow, to connect with others, to participate in this increasingly digital world. The digital world is our world now, for better and for worse. The vulnerabilities that exist in software exist in systems we all use every day. The threats that concern security professionals are threats that could, in theory, affect any of us. The questions about privacy and security, about what information should be collected and who should have access to it, about how to balance security with convenience, about how to protect ourselves without giving up the benefits that digital technology provides. These are questions that matter to everyone, not just to specialists and professionals and government officials. But we do not need to be paralyzed by fear of these threats. We do not need to retreat from technology or reject the digital world or view every connected device with suspicion. We simply need to be aware, to be thoughtful, to take reasonable precautions that are appropriate to our individual risk profiles. We need to update our software when prompted, because those updates often contain critical security fixes. We need to use strong, unique passwords and enable two-factor authentication when it is available. We need to be skeptical of suspicious emails and messages, especially those that ask us to click links or provide personal information. These small actions, these basic practices, multiplied across millions of users, make a real difference in overall security. They make it harder for attackers to succeed, force them to work harder, and reduce the pool of easy targets. And we need to remember that behind all the technology, behind all the exploits and defenses and incidents and responses, there are people. People like Jake Williams, whose lives are affected by these events in profound and personal ways. People working third shift in security operations centers, monitoring networks while the rest of us sleep. People developing software and trying to make it secure, balancing functionality with safety, features with protection. People in intelligence agencies making difficult decisions about how to protect national security, decisions that may have consequences they cannot fully foresee. All of them are human. All of them are fallible. All of them are doing their best in complicated situations where perfect solutions do not exist. As you drift off to sleep, let the complexity of this story fade into the background. Let the technical details recede, the names of tools and exploits and vulnerabilities becoming distant and abstract. Let the geopolitical tensions soften, the questions about Russian involvement and information operations becoming less immediate. What remains is simply a story about people navigating a complex world, doing difficult work under challenging circumstances, making hard choices with imperfect information, and living with the results of those choices. It is, in that sense, a very human story, one that resonates because we all face our own versions of these challenges in our own lives, even if the stakes are different and the specifics are different. The shadow brokers are silent now. Their Twitter accounts remain dormant. Their websites are unchanged. Whether they will ever return remains unknown, a question hanging unanswered in the digital air. Jake Williams continues his journey, teaching and consulting and responding to incidents, living with the consequences of being publicly identified, but also finding meaning in the work he does to help others defend their networks. The exploits that were released are still being used in attacks around the world, but are also being defended against more effectively than ever before. The questions about zero-day disclosure and the NSA's approach to vulnerabilities continue to be debated in policy circles and academic journals and conference presentations. Life goes on, in the digital realm and everywhere else, adapting to new realities, incorporating new knowledge, moving forward because that is what life does. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought of all. For all the drama of the shadow broker's story, for all the significant events and serious consequences we have discussed over these many chapters, the world continues. Systems continue to function. The internet still works. People still communicate and shop and learn and connect online. Businesses still operate. Governments still provide services. The fundamental infrastructure of modern digital life persists, defended by thousands of dedicated professionals, maintained by millions of systems administrators and network engineers and security analysts, used by billions of people who mostly never think about the complex systems underlying their digital activities. So rest easy, knowing that while the digital world has its threats and vulnerabilities, while secrets sometimes leak and tools sometimes fall into the wrong hands, while bad actors operate with increasing sophistication and concerning capabilities, the world also has its defenders and protections. Systems adapt over time. Defenses improve through lessons learned. The security community shares knowledge and collaborates across organizational and national boundaries. While individuals like Jake Williams sometimes find their lives upended by forces beyond their control, by events they could not have predicted or prevented, they also demonstrate remarkable resilience and the ability to adapt and continue contributing meaningfully to their fields. The story of shadow brokers is now part of history, a significant chapter in the ongoing evolution of cybersecurity, a case study that will be taught in courses and referenced in papers and discussed in conversations for years to come. It changed the landscape of digital security in meaningful and lasting ways. It forced conversations about vulnerability disclosure that needed to happen. It demonstrated the risks of hoarding 0 days in ways that theory alone never could. It showed the human cost of cyber operations, the way that actions in the digital realm can have profound effects on real people's lives. But it did not break the systems we rely on. It did not end the internet or destroy critical infrastructure or cause society to collapse. It simply revealed realities that were always there beneath the surface, forced us to confront truths we might have preferred to avoid, and initiated conversations that should lead, slowly, to better policies and practices. And now, as this long story comes to its close, as you settle into sleep, let it all fade into the background like a dream half remembered, present but not pressing, interesting but not alarming. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and new stories, new vulnerabilities to discover and patch, new attacks to defend against, new lessons to learn. But tonight, there is only rest, only the gentle drift towards sleep, only the quiet peace of a day ending and a night beginning, only the soft darkness that enfolds you like a blanket. If you found value in this journey through the Shadow Broker story, if these chapters helped you understand something about the digital world we all inhabit, if the calm narration helped you relax and drift towards sleep, then perhaps consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories to tell many more corners of the digital world to explore, many more nights when a gentle voice telling an interesting story might help you find rest. And if you know others who might benefit from these long-form documentaries designed for sleep, who might appreciate the combination of interesting content and soothing narration, who seek knowledge wrapped in calm, then perhaps share this with them. We are building a community here of curious minds who find peace in learning, who discover that understanding complex things can itself be a form of meditation, who know that the path to sleep need not be through empty thoughts, but can wind through fascinating stories told in soothing tones. Until we meet again, in another story on another night, rest well. The digital world will continue its endless dance of attack and defense, of vulnerability and patch, of secret and revelation. Security professionals will continue their vigilant watch. Researchers will continue finding flaws and fixing them. Attackers will continue probing defenses, and defenders will continue strengthening them. The great game will go on, as it always has and always will, as long as humans build complex systems and other humans seek to understand or exploit them. But tonight, none of that is your concern. Tonight, the watch belongs to others. Tonight, there is only sleep and the knowledge that tomorrow you will wake refreshed, having spent these hours in the company of an interesting story told in a calm voice, having learned something about the hidden infrastructure of the digital world, having understood a bit more about the complex reality underlying the simple act of clicking a button or typing a password or trusting that a system will work as intended. Sleep well, and may your dreams, if they come, be peaceful and free from exploits and vulnerabilities and midnight calls from security operation centers. May you rest deeply, knowing that while the world has its dangers and uncertainties, it also has its protections and its protectors. May you wake tomorrow with the story of shadow brokers residing somewhere in your memory, not as a source of anxiety, but as a reminder of human resilience, of the remarkable complexity of the systems we have built, of the dedication of those who work to keep those systems secure. Good night.